Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully quiet. So, dim the lights if you can. Put your phone somewhere it won't fall directly onto your face in 20 minutes. Find a comfortable position that somehow feels perfect now, but will absolutely become uncomfortable later. That's simply part of the ancient tradition of trying to fall asleep while listening to history. Tonight, we're wandering into the first light of the medieval world. Not the dramatic version with endless battles, flaming castles, and heroic speeches that somehow always happen in perfect weather. No, we're visiting the slower world. The world where dawn arrived because it always had, where smoke drifted from cottages long before breakfast, where kings woke up grumpy, monks complained about cold mornings, and almost everyone secretly wished they could stay in bed just a little longer. History often introduces the Middle Ages with grand events. Empires collapse, kingdoms rise, dynasties begin, but ordinary mornings rarely cared about any of that. A rooster certainly didn't. Neither did the woman grinding grain before sunrise or the sleepy servant trying not to spill water on the castle floor for the third morning this week. So tonight we'll move slowly. We'll drift through villages, monasteries, royal halls, and quiet roads as Europe stretches awake beneath a pale gray sky. No rushing. No loud surprises, just history taking its time. Imagine opening your eyes sometime around the year 900. There is no alarm clock. There is no glowing phone screen reminding you that you slept exactly 6 hours and 23 minutes. Instead, your room slowly changes color. Not because someone turned on a light, because dawn itself is entering through a tiny window no larger than a dinner plate. The air is cool. Actually cold. Stone buildings are excellent at keeping heat out during summer. Unfortunately, they're equally talented at keeping cold inside for most of the year. Your blanket is probably made of wool. It weighs enough to make getting out from underneath it feel like negotiating with a stubborn sheep. Outside, the village has already begun making sounds. Someone is chopping wood. A dog has decided that silence is unacceptable. A rooster, who clearly considers himself middle management for the entire countryside, announces another sunrise with great confidence. Nobody asked him. He does it anyway, because of course he does. The first thing many medieval people experienced every morning wasn't breakfast. It was work. Work had started long before they fully woke up. Fields didn't politely wait until everyone felt motivated. Animals certainly didn't. Cows expected milking. Chickens expected feeding. Pigs expected. Well, they expected almost anything edible. Pigs have always maintained fairly relaxed dietary standards. The medieval farmer understood something modern office workers might recognize. Monday wasn't the problem. Every day was Monday. There were very few weekends, as we understand them. There were feast days and holy celebrations throughout the year, certainly. But survival didn't enjoy taking holidays. The wheat continued growing. The weather continued changing. The roof continued leaking. Life politely refused to pause. Now, let's quietly stroll toward a monastery. The monks are already awake. Actually, many of them have been awake for hours. Monastic schedules could be astonishingly demanding. Prayers structure the entire day. Night prayers, morning prayers, daytime prayers, evening prayers. It sometimes feels as though medieval monasteries invented productivity culture centuries before motivational podcasts existed. Only instead of maximize your morning routine, it was please arrive before dawn to sing psalms. The buildings themselves were peaceful. Stone corridors echoed softly beneath sandaled feet. Candles flickered. Books rested carefully on wooden desks. Outside, gardens slowly brightened beneath the rising sun. Inside, scribes patiently copied manuscripts one careful letter at a time. Imagine writing an entire book, by hand, every letter, every sentence, every page. One small mistake meant scraping away ink with a knife before trying again. Modern autocorrect suddenly seems rather generous. Of course, copying manuscripts required remarkable patience, which is fortunate, because patience was practically the official currency of monastic life. Hours could disappear while a monk decorated a single capital letter with vines, birds, flowers, or tiny imaginary creatures who looked vaguely surprised to exist. Sometimes those decorations became unexpectedly humorous. A serious religious manuscript might suddenly include a rabbit chasing a knight, or a snail confronting an armored soldier. Historians still debate why. Perhaps symbolism, perhaps satire, or perhaps one very bored illustrator quietly decided medieval life needed slightly more confused snails. Honestly, fair enough. Meanwhile, in another part of Europe, someone far wealthier is also waking up. A king, despite what fairy tales suggest, being medieval royalty rarely guaranteed luxurious mornings. Castles were impressive. Comfortable? That depended. Stone walls trapped cold air. Drafts wandered through corridors with surprising enthusiasm. Windows remained small because large windows were excellent invitations for arrows. Fireplaces helped. Eventually, once someone else lit them. Royal bedrooms often bustled with servants almost immediately after dawn. Privacy wasn't exactly fashionable. Kings rarely enjoyed peaceful mornings alone. Servants entered carrying water. Officials arrived with messages. Advisors waited nearby. Priests appeared. Messengers delivered reports from distant estates. Everyone seemed convinced their particular problem deserved immediate royal attention. Imagine opening your eyes and immediately hearing, "Your Majesty, there's a dispute over sheep." 5 minutes later, "Your Majesty, taxes from the western villages have arrived." Then, "Your Majesty, someone claims ownership of 3 suspiciously identical cows." Kings spent astonishing amounts of time solving surprisingly ordinary arguments. History remembers battles. Administration remembered sheep. Lots and lots of sheep. Let's meet one king who knew something about complicated mornings. Charlemagne. Although by the year 900 he had already died, his enormous influence still shaped Europe. People remembered him almost like a legendary figure. He had ruled an empire stretching across much of Western Europe. He encouraged education, supported monasteries, reformed administration, promoted learning, and apparently enjoyed swimming with remarkable enthusiasm. Contemporary writers mention this often enough that it becomes strangely memorable. Imagine becoming one of Europe's greatest rulers, only for future generations to repeatedly mention, "Oh, yes, excellent emperor. Also quite fond of swimming." History can be wonderfully unpredictable about what survives. Charlemagne's court attempted to revive learning after centuries of decline. Scholars gathered, books were copied, Latin improved, schools developed. This movement became known today as the Carolingian Renaissance, which sounds extremely elegant. In reality, it involved countless tired scholars trying to make handwriting easier to read. Sometimes civilization advances through epic victories. Sometimes it advances because someone finally invents better punctuation. Far away, another ruler approached mornings rather differently. King Athelstan of England, a thoughtful king, serious, organized, patient. He inherited a kingdom still finding its identity after generations of Viking invasions and competing rulers. His court attracted scholars from across Europe. Diplomacy mattered enormously. So did paperwork. Again, history quietly returns to paperwork. Royal charters, land grants, legal documents, lists, always lists. One almost imagines medieval clerks inventing stacks of parchment simply because they enjoyed watching nobles search through them later. Of course they didn't. Probably. Now, let's leave royal halls for a while. The village bakery has become wonderfully busy. Bread formed the foundation of daily life. Rich or poor, almost everyone depended on it. The quality varied enormously. Nobles enjoyed finer white bread. Ordinary villagers usually ate darker loaves containing rye, barley, oats, or whatever local harvest allowed. Sometimes tiny bits of grit found their way into flour. Millstones slowly wore down over years of grinding grain. Microscopic stone fragments mixed with flour. People unknowingly ate them. Dentists examining medieval skeletons often notice extraordinary tooth wear, not entirely from sugar, from bread itself. Imagine bread quietly sanding down your teeth over decades. Breakfast suddenly feels unexpectedly adventurous. Fresh bread filled villages with warm smells. One of humanity's oldest comforts. Some things barely change. Warm bread, morning light, the satisfaction of sitting quietly while the day begins. Across 1,000 years, those moments remain strangely familiar. Children woke too. Medieval childhood wasn't identical to adulthood, despite older myths suggesting children immediately became tiny adults wearing serious expressions. They played, they laughed, they learned games. They chased animals they probably shouldn't chase. Parents worried. Teachers complained. Some things truly never evolve. Children often help with household tasks from relatively young ages. Fetching water, watching animals, collecting firewood, learning family trades. Responsibility arrived earlier than today, but curiosity arrived right on schedule. A curious child in the year 1100 looked remarkably similar to one today. Both wanted answers. Both occasionally ignored instructions. Both discovered exactly why adults had given those instructions in the first place, usually moments too late. Let's quietly drift toward the castle kitchens. They're already alive with activity, preparing meals for dozens, sometimes hundreds, required extraordinary organization. Bread baked continuously, stews simmered, meat roasted when available. Fish appeared frequently, especially during religious fasting days. Kitchen staff worked beside enormous fireplaces generating relentless heat, while nobles discussed politics upstairs. Someone downstairs worried about onions. And honestly, without the onions, politics probably became much less enjoyable. Great kingdoms have occasionally depended upon surprisingly competent cooks. Not every famous advisor wore expensive robes. Some carried wooden spoons. Morning sunlight slowly climbs higher now. Mist lifts from rivers. Roads become busier. Merchants prepare wagons. Pilgrims continue long journeys. Blacksmiths begin hammering metal. Fields fill with workers. The medieval world has awakened completely. Yet beneath all this movement exists remarkable continuity. People hoped for good harvests. They worried about illness. They loved families. Argued with neighbors. Dreamed about better futures. Complained about weather. Wondered whether rulers knew what they were doing. Spoiler alert, the answer varied considerably. And perhaps that's comforting. Across centuries, despite enormous differences in technology, clothing, religion, politics, and language, human nature remained wonderfully recognizable. Someone somewhere was still oversleeping. Someone still forgot an important appointment. Someone still insisted their local problems deserved national attention. Some habits survive every century. As the morning grows brighter, we'll continue our slow journey deeper into medieval life next time. We'll meet stranger kings, more peculiar queens, monks with surprisingly sharp senses of humor, dynasties that somehow made spectacularly questionable marriage decisions, and noble families who repeatedly proved that having unlimited wealth does not automatically include unlimited common sense. Because medieval history, once you slow down enough to notice it, isn't just a parade of battles and crowns. It's a collection of ordinary mornings, lived by extraordinary people who were often far stranger and far more human than the legends ever admitted. The sun has climbed a little higher now, not dramatically, just enough of the shadows to retreat from the courtyard, one quiet stone at a time. If you're getting comfortable, that's perfect. Maybe you've already reached that pleasant stage where the story starts blending into dreams. If not, don't worry. The Middle Ages moved slowly. We're going to do the same. So let's leave the little farming village behind for a while and wander toward one of the largest castles in northern Europe around the 11th century. From a distance, it looks magnificent. Tall towers, high walls, flags gently moving in the morning breeze. The kind of place that modern movies usually introduce with dramatic music and an eagle circling overhead. Reality was less cinematic. The first thing you would probably notice wasn't the grandeur. It was the smell. Castles were full of people, not just kings and queens. Hundreds of people, servants, soldiers, priests, kitchen workers, stable boys, visiting merchants, messengers, dogs, cats, horses, occasionally a goat that absolutely wasn't supposed to be inside, but somehow managed it anyway, because goats have never accepted the idea of restricted access. The mixture of fireplaces, wet wool, horses, cooking meat, candles, smoke, damp stone, leather, and humanity created a scent unlike anything most of us experience today. It wasn't necessarily unbearable, just very medieval. After a few days, you probably wouldn't even notice it anymore. Humans are remarkably adaptable. We can become accustomed to almost anything, even sharing breakfast with 20 armored knights and 3 suspicious chickens. The Great Hall formed the heart of castle life. Almost everything happened here. Meals, meetings, celebrations, court cases, political discussions, marriage negotiations, arguments, more arguments, sometimes even arguments about the previous arguments. If walls could grow tired, medieval castle walls would have desperately wanted one quiet afternoon. Long wooden tables stretched across the room. Rushes covered the floor. People often imagine castles sparkling with polished stone. The reality involved a surprising amount of straw scattered across the ground. Fresh rushes helped absorb dirt and moisture. They also masked unpleasant smells, at least for a while. Eventually they had to be replaced, and everyone silently agreed it was definitely time. The fireplace dominated one end of the hall. Its smoke usually escaped through openings in the roof. Usually. Sometimes the smoke preferred lingering indoors first. Apparently, even smoke appreciated a leisurely morning. Now imagine being a servant here. You probably rose before almost everyone else, before the nobles, before many guards, sometimes before the sun itself. Your day began with fires. Every fireplace had to be relit, ash removed, fresh wood carried inside, water fetched, candles prepared, floors swept, tables arranged, beds aired, animals fed, laundry sorted, all before breakfast. Modern people often complain about answering emails before coffee. A medieval servant might have already carried 50 buckets of water before even seeing a piece of bread. Perspective can be humbling. Meanwhile, upstairs, the lord of the castle is waking. He may own thousands of acres. He may command hundreds of soldiers. His family may trace their ancestry back through generations of noble blood. Yet the first challenge of his day is getting dressed, which sounds simple. It wasn't. Layers upon layers of clothing, undergarments, tunics, belts, boots, cloaks, depending on status. Assistants help with much of it. Being powerful apparently meant becoming increasingly unable to put on your own clothes quickly. Royal fashion had a curious relationship with practicality. The richer someone became, the more complicated dressing seemed to get. Perhaps history's greatest luxury has always been convincing someone else to button your sleeves. Let's quietly meet one of England's more fascinating rulers, King Henry I. He ruled from 1100 until 1135. Henry was intelligent, exceptionally intelligent, according to many contemporaries. He loved administration, loved reading documents, loved organizing government. He was, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of someone who genuinely enjoys spreadsheets. There is always one. Henry transformed royal government into a far more organized machine. Records improved. Taxes became more efficient. Courts expanded. Officials became more accountable. Not exactly thrilling material for an action movie, but kingdoms rarely survive without someone willing to organize the paperwork. Henry reportedly possessed an astonishing memory. He remembered names, faces, land disputes, legal agreements, who owed what, who had promised what, which noble was quietly pretending not to remember that promise. Imagine trying to deceive a king who remembered conversations from years earlier. Rather inconvenient. His officials probably learned very quickly that "I forgot" was not an especially persuasive excuse. Henry also collected exotic animals, because apparently medieval kings occasionally looked around and thought, you know what this castle needs? A lion, or perhaps a leopard, maybe even a camel. Visitors described remarkable creatures living in royal collections. Eventually, these collections evolved into what became the famous royal menagerie at the Tower of London. Human beings have apparently always enjoyed looking at unusual animals and saying, well, that's certainly different. Some traditions are timeless. Now, let's float over to another royal household. Across the English Channel, noble families were engaged in one of medieval Europe's favorite hobbies, marrying cousins. Not every cousin, but enough cousins to keep future genealogists permanently employed. Dynastic marriages rarely focus on romance. Love occasionally happened. It simply wasn't the primary objective. Land mattered, power mattered, peace treaties mattered, claims to distant territories mattered. Whether the bride and groom had actually spoken to one another before the wedding, less important. Sometimes much less. Imagine receiving news that you're marrying someone you've never met because your grandfather signed an agreement 15 years earlier. Medieval diplomacy had a wonderfully direct approach. Congratulations, you're now politically useful. Please pack accordingly. These marriages gradually created astonishingly interconnected royal families. A princess born in Normandy might marry into Scotland, her sister into Germany, a cousin into France, another relative into Castile. After several generations, nearly every European royal seemed related somehow. Family reunions must have been extraordinarily complicated, although they probably called them peace conferences. Sometimes, of course, this habit eventually produced consequences, quite noticeable ones. Generation after generation of relatives marrying relatives slowly reduced genetic diversity. The most famous examples would come centuries later with the Habsburg dynasty. We'll spend plenty of peaceful evenings visiting them later. Trust me, they deserve their own marathon. For now, it's enough to notice the pattern beginning. One carefully arranged marriage, then another, because apparently no one wanted to widen the family tree if they could simply keep decorating the existing branches. Let's leave the nobles for a little while. The castle kitchens are reaching full speed. Imagine dozens of cooks moving around enormous fireplaces. Huge iron cauldrons bubble steadily. Bread emerges from ovens. Fish is cleaned. Vegetables chopped. Herbs gathered. The head cook somehow remembers meals for 150 people. Without written recipes, without digital timers, without refrigerators, without anyone asking whether dinner should be gluten-free. Frankly, an impressive achievement. Spices arrive from astonishing distances. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. Some travel thousands of miles before reaching Europe. These tiny jars of flavor cost extraordinary amounts. Owning spices wasn't merely about taste. It quietly announced wealth. Sprinkling pepper over dinner essentially declared, I can afford to season my food with something that crossed continents. Rather subtle, rather expensive. Water wasn't always a preferred drink. Not because medieval people somehow believed water was evil. That's a persistent myth. Clean water certainly existed. Springs, wells, streams. But in crowded settlements, contamination could become a genuine problem. Ale therefore appeared frequently. Usually much weaker than modern beer. Even children sometimes drank small ale with very low alcohol content. It was simply part of daily nutrition. A medieval brewer held an important position within many households. Entire communities quietly depended upon competent brewing. No pressure. Let's wander outside. The castle stables are already busy. Horses represented extraordinary wealth. A trained warhorse cost enormous sums. These weren't simply transportation. They were military technology. Powerful, expensive, carefully bred. Knight and horse together formed a remarkably sophisticated fighting system. Maintaining that horse required stable workers, blacksmiths, farriers, saddle makers, and veterinarians of varying experience. Behind every glamorous knight stood an army of people making sure the horse remained healthy. History often celebrates heroes. Heroes generally required excellent logistics. Nearby, young squires begin training. Most are teenagers, some even younger. Wooden swords strike wooden shields. Instructors shout corrections. Again and again, patience appears to have been mandatory for medieval teachers. Some squires dream of becoming legendary knights. Others probably dream of sleeping another hour. Both ambitions seem understandable. Training lasted years. Horsemanship, swordsmanship, etiquette, religion, administration, conversation. A knight wasn't expected merely to fight. He represented noble ideals. At least in theory. Reality occasionally wandered away from theory, quite enthusiastically. Let's meet another ruler, William the Conqueror, a man whose nickname sounds permanently dramatic. William began life with considerable disadvantages. He was born outside formal marriage. His rivals never allowed him to forget it. Children can be surprisingly cruel. Adults with armies often prove even worse. Despite constant opposition, William secured Normandy, then in 1066 crossed the English Channel. The Battle of Hastings changed English history forever. We'll avoid lingering on the violence tonight. Instead, notice what happened afterward. William became obsessed with organization, land surveys, tax records, property ownership, administration. Again, administration quietly appears behind every successful kingdom. His greatest bureaucratic achievement became the Doomsday Book, an astonishing survey recording landowners, livestock, villages, mills, forests, fisheries, and resources across much of England. Imagine conducting a nationwide census without cars, without telephones, without computers, just determined officials riding horses through mud asking endless questions. Some villagers probably saw them approaching and sighed deeply. Oh no, more paperwork. Certain experiences truly unite humanity across centuries. William himself enjoyed hunting immensely. Royal forests expanded dramatically. Large areas became protected hunting grounds. Excellent news if you happen to be a deer. Actually, not excellent news for the deer. Excellent news for preserving forests. Less excellent for anyone hoping to farm there. Kings occasionally loved nature in very selective ways. Inside castles, entertainment remained surprisingly diverse. Storytellers visited. Musicians performed. Jugglers entertained guests. Board games appeared frequently. Chess became increasingly fashionable after arriving from the Islamic world. Nobles gathered around carved wooden boards, carefully considering each move. Some became intensely competitive. Apparently, quietly judging someone's chess strategy has been a respectable pastime for nearly 1,000 years. Who knew? As afternoon slowly approaches, the castle settles into its rhythm. Messengers come and go. Dogs nap beneath tables. Servants continue endless tasks. Children chase each other through courtyards until someone important reminds them not to. The king signs another charter. The steward checks another account. The cook tastes another pot of stew. Life continues. Not glamorous every moment. Not dramatic every hour. Simply steady, like the slow turning of seasons. And perhaps that's the greatest surprise about medieval castles. They weren't stages waiting for famous moments. They were homes, busy, noisy, sometimes uncomfortable, filled with ordinary routines that quietly supported extraordinary history. Tonight, we've only wandered through one morning and part of one day. There are still monasteries to revisit, queens whose lives were stranger than fiction, princes raised under impossible expectations, dynasties that somehow kept making the same mistakes generation after generation, and, naturally, a few kings whose confidence dramatically exceeded their common sense, because medieval Europe never seemed to run out of those. So settle a little deeper into your blanket. The castle gates remain open. Our slow journey through the medieval dawn has only just begun. The castle has settled into its familiar rhythm now. The fires burn a little brighter. The kitchens have survived breakfast. The servants have already completed enough work to make a modern fitness tracker quietly give up. Outside, sunlight stretches across fields still damp with dew. Inside, somewhere deep within the castle, another day is beginning for someone whose life looked luxurious from a distance, and surprisingly exhausting up close. Let's quietly visit the queen. Not because queens live more comfortably than everyone else, although they certainly had better blankets, but because their daily lives were often much stranger than popular history allows. Modern stories tend to imagine medieval queens drifting gracefully through castles, wearing magnificent dresses, while occasionally looking thoughtfully out of stained glass windows. Reality was considerably busier. A queen's morning usually began with people. Far too many people. Ladies in waiting enter her chambers. Servants carried fresh water. Clerics arrived with schedules. Messengers delivered letters. Officials requested signatures. Tailors appeared carrying new garments. Physicians occasionally insisted on checking her health. And somewhere in the middle of all this, someone politely asked what she might like for breakfast. Assuming anyone remembered breakfast, privacy, once again, was almost non-existent. Even sleeping could become a semi-public activity. Royal bedrooms weren't simply bedrooms. They were political spaces. Power lived there. Visitors arrived constantly. Important conversations happened before sunrise. Diplomacy apparently believed in early mornings. Getting dressed required time, not because clothing was especially fashionable by modern standards. Although wealthy fabrics could certainly be beautiful, it was because there were layers. Linen first, then gowns, then belts, then cloaks, then jewelry appropriate for the day's ceremonies. Each item communicated status, rank, family, authority. Clothing acted almost like another language. A noble woman could quietly announce enormous wealth simply through the quality of her embroidery. No words required, just exceptionally expensive thread, which somehow feels like the medieval version of arriving in a luxury car. Subtle, but not really. Now, let's meet one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, Empress Matilda. Her story is wonderfully complicated. And by wonderfully complicated, I mean historians have spent centuries untangling it. Matilda was born around 1102. She happened to be the daughter of King Henry I of England, the remarkably organized king we met earlier. From childhood, she occupied an unusual position. Most royal daughters expected political marriages. Matilda certainly received one. At only 8 years old, she became engaged to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. Eventually, she traveled across Europe to Germany. Imagine that journey. Months on horseback, through forests, across rivers, over mountains, leaving behind nearly everyone familiar, all before reaching adulthood. International travel today can be exhausting. At least airports usually provide coffee. As Holy Roman Empress, Matilda entered one of Europe's most prestigious courts. Ceremonies surrounded her. Diplomats greeted her. Powerful nobles watched every movement. Expectations became enormous. Yet despite the glittering title, reality remained uncertain. Her husband died without children. Suddenly Matilda found herself widowed. Still young, still politically valuable, still expected to serve dynastic interests. Royal women rarely control the direction of their own lives. History often moved them like remarkably expensive chess pieces. She eventually returned to England. Her father now faced an enormous problem. His only legitimate son had died in the disastrous sinking of the White Ship in 1120. It was one of medieval Europe's greatest royal tragedies. We'll linger with that quiet story another evening. Tonight, simply know that Henry suddenly lacked a clear male heir. So he did something rather bold. He declared Matilda his successor. This sounds straightforward. It absolutely wasn't. Many nobles publicly agreed, then privately began reconsidering. Because medieval politics possessed a fascinating relationship with promises, people often honored them, unless honoring them became inconvenient. Then creative reinterpretation appeared remarkably quickly. When Henry I died in 1135, Matilda expected to inherit England. Instead, her cousin Stephen seized the throne, because apparently waiting your turn wasn't especially fashionable among ambitious medieval nobles. What followed became a long period historians call the Anarchy. The name alone sounds wonderfully dramatic. Reality mostly consisted of castles changing hands, noble alliances shifting repeatedly, endless negotiations, occasional fighting, and everyone becoming increasingly exhausted. Imagine years of political uncertainty, taxes interrupted, justice delayed, travel becoming dangerous, villages unsure which ruler technically governed them this month. Ordinary people usually suffered most whenever powerful families disagreed. That lesson appears with astonishing regularity throughout history. Matilda herself proved intelligent, determined, capable. She led armies, negotiated alliances, directed campaigns, ruled territories. Many chroniclers admired her abilities. Some did not admire her personality. She could appear proud, demanding, unwilling to compromise. although it's worth remembering something curious. Male rulers displaying confidence were often described as strong. Female rulers displaying similar confidence occasionally became arrogant. Historical sources carry human biases. Even medieval writers had opinions, sometimes rather loud ones. Reading old chronicles therefore requires gentle caution. Every storyteller, including those writing 900 years ago, had favorite characters, and characters they quietly hoped would lose. Let's drift away from politics for a little while. The Queen's Chapel has become peaceful. Candles flicker. Morning prayers continue softly. Religion shaped almost every part of medieval royal life, not simply as ceremony, but as genuine belief. Kings prayed, queens prayed, servants prayed, soldiers prayed, farmers prayed. Children learned prayers almost as early as they learned language. The calendar itself revolved around religious festivals. Christmas, Easter, saints' feast days, periods of fasting, days of celebration. Time itself felt different. Rather than asking whether something happened in March, someone might remember it happened shortly after the feast of St. Michael. The entire year breathed according to the rhythm of the church. Books remained precious. A queen's library would have appeared surprisingly small by modern standards. Not because queens disliked reading. Books simply required extraordinary labor. Each manuscript represented months, sometimes years, of careful work. Pages made from parchment, ink mixed by hand, letters copied individually, illustrations painted patiently. Owning 20 books could represent astonishing wealth. Today, many of us accidentally own more books than that without remembering where half of them came from. History occasionally enjoys reminding us how fortunate modern abundance truly is. Now, let's quietly visit Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most extraordinary queen of the entire medieval age. Calling Eleanor merely interesting feels rather like calling the Atlantic Ocean slightly damp. She inherited one of Europe's richest territories, Aquitaine, a land famous for vineyards, poetry, music, and culture. She first married Louis VII of France, two powerful young rulers. On paper, an excellent match. Reality politely disagreed. Louis was deeply religious, thoughtful, reserved. He almost became a monk before unexpectedly inheriting the throne. Eleanor possessed an entirely different personality. She enjoyed lively courts, conversation, music, poetry, travel, adventure. Together they resembled two people who accidentally booked the same vacation despite wanting completely different holidays. The marriage struggled, not because either person lacked intelligence, simply because compatibility occasionally matters. Even among kings. They traveled together on the Second Crusade. The journey proved exhausting. Long distances, harsh conditions, political disagreements, military disappointments. Rumors spread constantly, some true, many wildly imaginative. Medieval gossip traveled surprisingly efficiently. Apparently people have always enjoyed discussing celebrities, even when those celebrities wore crowns instead of appearing on magazine covers. Eventually, the marriage ended, officially annulled. Not especially common, but certainly significant. And then Eleanor did something extraordinary. Only weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England. One queen, two kingdoms. An astonishing political transformation. France watched in collective disbelief, because Eleanor's vast lands now strengthened England instead. Diplomatic planners across Europe probably develop headaches simultaneously. Henry II himself deserves quiet attention. Energetic, intelligent, restless. He seemed almost incapable of remaining still. Contemporary writers described him constantly traveling, inspecting castles, holding court, meeting officials, crossing rivers, crossing mountains, crossing entire kingdoms. If medieval rulers collected frequent traveler points, Henry would have qualified for every reward. He governed through movement. Rather than waiting for problems to reach him, he visited the problems personally. Sometimes the problems wished he hadn't. Henry and Eleanor eventually had 8 children, an impressive royal family. Also, a remarkably argumentative one. Their sons became famous for rebelling against their father, repeatedly. Richard, Geoffrey, young Henry, John. At various moments, almost everyone seemed upset with almost everyone else. Family dinners must have required extraordinary diplomacy. Imagine trying to organize seating arrangements. Perhaps that's why medieval banquets were so large. Keeping rebellious princes at opposite ends of the hall probably seemed sensible. Let's gently leave royal families behind for a moment. Outside the castle walls, ordinary women continue their own busy mornings. Many managed households, prepared food, raised children, worked fields, produced cloth, cared for animals, helped with harvests, ran small businesses. Life demanded versatility. A village household functioned almost like a tiny company. Everyone contributed. Everyone possessed valuable skills. One person baked. Another repaired tools. Someone spun wool. Someone tended gardens. Survival depended upon cooperation, not individual achievement. Communities remained tightly connected because isolation rarely worked. Neighbors mattered enormously. Borrowing tools, sharing labor, helping during harvest, supporting families after illness. Even medieval villages understood something modern life occasionally forgets. People generally survive better together. As afternoon light softens, castle corridors become quieter. Some nobles rest. Children finally grow tired. Dogs stretch lazily beside fireplaces. Scribes continue writing. Monks continue copying. Servants continue working. They always seem to continue working. Somewhere, a messenger begins another long journey carrying letters that may change kingdoms. Elsewhere, a farmer quietly repairs a fence. History remembers the messenger. The fence still needed repairing. Both tasks mattered. Perhaps that's one of the gentlest truths hidden inside the Middle Ages. Grand events never replaced ordinary life. They simply unfolded beside it, while kings argued about crowns. Someone milked cows, while queens negotiated alliances. Someone baked bread. While dynasties rose and fell, morning still arrived. The sun still crossed the sky. Children still laughed. Old people still shared stories. Dogs still barked at absolutely nothing. Or perhaps it's something only dogs considered urgent. They've kept that habit remarkably consistent. So settle a little deeper beneath your blanket. The candles burn lower now. The castle grows calmer. By now, the afternoon has drifted quietly toward evening. The castle walls glow with softer light. Long shadows stretch across the courtyards. The kitchen fires never truly go out, but they no longer roar with the frantic urgency of breakfast. Dogs have settled beneath benches. The horses are calmer. Even the endlessly busy servants seem to move with slightly slower steps. It's a peaceful moment. So let's leave the castle behind for a little while. We'll walk along a narrow dirt road bordered by fields of barley and oats. The air smells of damp earth, wild herbs, and distant with smoke. Birds chatter somewhere in the hedgerows. A cart creaks slowly past us. Its wheels complain about every single bump. Apparently wooden wheels have always been dramatic. Far ahead, resting on a gentle hill, stands a monastery. Not enormous, not covered in gold, just quiet, almost surprisingly quiet. The closer we get, the more the outside world begins to fade. The shouting farmers become distant. The barking dogs become faint. Even the wind seems to lower its voice. Monasteries became some of the calmest places in medieval Europe. Not because life there was easy, far from it, but because almost everything followed a rhythm, a carefully ordered rhythm. The same bells, the same prayers, the same meals, the same work. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade. If medieval castles felt like busy government offices, monasteries often felt like giant clocks built from stone and patience. Imagine becoming a monk around the year 1050. You don't arrive carrying many possessions, perhaps a few clothes, a knife, maybe a treasured book if your family happened to own one. Otherwise, very little. The monastery provides almost everything else. Your days no longer belong entirely to you. Instead, they belong to schedule, a remarkably strict one. Long before sunrise, the bell rings. It doesn't ask whether you're tired. It doesn't care if winter has made your blankets unusually warm. The bell simply rings. Everyone rises. Everyone dresses. Everyone walks silently toward the church. Even if snow covers the ground. Even if rain beats against the roof. Even if yesterday's work left your muscles aching. The prayers begin. Candles flicker. Voices rise together. The Latin words echo gently through the stone building. Outside, the rest of Europe still sleeps. Modern historians sometimes estimate that monks prayed together 8 times every day. 8. Imagine attending 8 scheduled gatherings every single day for decades. Meetings today already feel excessive after 2. The difference, of course, is that medieval monks believed these prayers helped maintain the spiritual order of the world itself. To them, this was a routine. It was purpose. That belief shaped everything. One famous monastery became almost legendary, the Abbey of Cluny in France. Founded in 910, it grew into one of the most influential religious institutions in Europe. Its reputation spread astonishingly far. Kings admired it. Popes respected it. Nobles donated land. Pilgrims visited. Other monasteries copied its customs. Cluny became famous partly because it emphasized beautiful worship, long ceremonies, carefully sung prayers, magnificent architecture. Some critics quietly complained that Cluny spent perhaps a little too much time praying and not quite enough time doing manual labor. Others insisted the prayers themselves were labor. As usual, history offered plenty of opinions. Agreement remained optional. Life inside these monasteries was entirely silent. That's another common myth. Certain hours required silence. Meals might pass without conversation, while one monk read aloud from scripture. But outside those moments, monks certainly spoke. They discussed farming, books, politics, the weather, repairs, visitors. Even monks occasionally complained, because human beings have apparently complained about cold winters since the invention of winter. Let's quietly step into the scriptorium. This may be the most peaceful room in the entire monastery. Rows of wooden desks sit beside narrow windows. Sunlight falls across sheets of parchment. The room smells faintly of ink, leather, and candle wax. Several monks sit with remarkable stillness. One carefully sharpens a feather quill. Another mixes ink. Another slowly copies lines of Latin. Nobody rushes. Nobody can rush. A single page may require hours. An entire Bible, years, sometimes generations. Books represented one of humanity's greatest investments of patience. Every letter mattered. Every sentence required concentration. One sneeze at the wrong moment could become deeply inconvenient. Fortunately, history rarely records catastrophic sneezing incidents. Perhaps medieval chroniclers simply spared us those details. The beautiful decorated letters at the beginning of chapters became miniature works of art. Bright blues, deep reds, gold leaf, tiny flowers, twisting vines, birds, dragons, curious little rabbits. Occasionally a monkey doing something completely unexpected. Scholars still smile when discovering these playful illustrations. Apparently, even very serious monks appreciated tiny visual jokes. One manuscript shows a fox preaching to geese. Another depicts knights fighting snails. The famous medieval snail appears again. Nobody knows exactly why. Perhaps the snail symbolized cowardice. Perhaps pride. Perhaps evil. Or perhaps one illustrator thought, you know what this page needs? A surprisingly confident snail. After 900 years, the mystery survives. Sometimes history keeps its best jokes to itself. Books copied in monasteries preserved enormous amounts of knowledge. Without these patient scribes, countless ancient texts might have disappeared forever. Works by Roman historians, Greek philosophers, religious writers, medical treatises, poetry, mathematics, grammar, astronomy, generation after generation quietly copied knowledge by hand. It's difficult to overstate how important that work became. Imagine civilization balanced on shelves of handwritten books. Because, in many ways, it was. Of course, monasteries weren't simply libraries. They were also farms. Large farms, Many monasteries own fields, vineyards, orchards, mills, fisheries, and forests. Monks worked the land, or supervised lay workers who did. Gardens produced vegetables, herbs, fruit, medicinal plants. Some monasteries became remarkably skilled at agriculture, experimenting with irrigation, improving vineyards, developing fish ponds, growing better crops. Quiet innovation happened constantly. History often celebrates inventors with dramatic stories. Sometimes innovation looked more like a monk patiently wondering whether beans might grow better 2 rows farther south. Progress occasionally arrives wearing muddy sandals. Speaking of gardens, let's wander through one. The monastery herb garden feels wonderfully organized. Every plant has a purpose. Sage, rosemary, mint, fennel, lavender, chamomile. Monks studied herbs carefully. Medicine during the Middle Ages remained limited compared with modern science. Yet people observed nature closely. Some remedies genuinely helped. Others, less so. A physician might recommend honey for wounds. An excellent idea, as it turns out. Then perhaps suggest wearing a certain stone around your neck for unrelated reasons. Not every medical theory aged equally well. Still, medieval medicine often receives an unfair reputation. Within the knowledge available at the time, many practitioners sincerely try to understand illness. Observation mattered. Experience mattered. Compassion mattered. They simply lacked centuries of future discoveries. One remarkable woman deserves gentle attention here. Hildegard of Bingen, born in 1098. She became one of medieval Europe's most extraordinary thinkers. Abbess, composer, writer, mystic, natural philosopher, advisor to kings, correspondent with popes. She seemed almost endlessly curious. Hildegard wrote about medicine, plants, animals, music, theology, human health, even the relationship between nature and the human body. Her letters reveal remarkable confidence. She advised powerful rulers without appearing intimidated, not a small achievement in the 12th century. She also composed beautiful music that still survives today. Imagine creating melodies nearly 900 years ago and having people continue singing them in the 21st century. That's quite a legacy. Hildegard also described vivid spiritual visions throughout her life. Modern scholars continue discussing exactly how to understand them. Religious experience? Migraine aura? Something else entirely? The honest answer remains: we don't know. History occasionally leaves room for mystery, and perhaps that's perfectly acceptable. Not every question demands immediate certainty. Now let's step outside again. The monastery bell rings across the valley. Farmers pause briefly. Travelers glance toward the sound. Nearby villages quietly measure part of their day by those bells. Time itself felt different in medieval Europe. Most ordinary people didn't own clocks. Mechanical clocks existed later, but remained uncommon. Instead, life followed natural rhythms. Sunrise, sunset, church bells, changing seasons, the flowering of certain plants, the arrival of migrating birds, harvest time, winter frost. Nature remained a great calendar. Nobody checked whether it was exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. The afternoon simply was, oddly enough, that sounds rather peaceful. Let's slowly continue toward the monastery kitchen. Dinner is modest. Bread, vegetables, perhaps beans, cheese, fish if the calendar permits. Meat appears less often than many people imagine, particularly for monks. Meals remain simple by design. Excess is discouraged, although medieval cooks still understood the value of making simple food taste pleasant. A warm loaf of fresh bread hardly requires luxury to become comforting. As evening settles over the countryside, candles begin replacing sunlight. The monks gather once more. Another prayer, another hymn, another quiet moment shared beneath stone arches. Outside, stars slowly emerge. Somewhere beyond the monastery walls, kings continue negotiating treaties. Queens continue managing courts. Merchants continue counting coins. Children continue chasing one another through village lanes until parents call them inside. Life continues everywhere. But inside these walls, everything slows, breathing slows, walking slows, speaking softens. Even time itself seems gentler. Perhaps that's why monasteries became places where knowledge survived. Patience had room to exist there. Care had room to exist there. And in a world that often felt uncertain, that quiet steadiness became one of medieval Europe's greatest treasures. So as darkness settles fully across the hills, we'll leave the monks to their evening prayers. Tomorrow we'll return to the roads beyond the monastery. We'll travel beside merchants, pilgrims, wandering scholars, and perhaps a few nobles who somehow managed to become lost despite insisting they knew exactly where they were going. Because confidence has never been a reliable substitute for directions, especially in the Middle Ages. And our slow journey through the medieval dawn continues. Night has quietly slipped away. No one noticed exactly when. The stars slowly faded. The eastern horizon softened into pale gray. A cool breeze drifted over the fields, carrying the scent of damp grass and freshly turned soil. Another medieval morning has arrived. The monastery bells have already welcomed it. The castle kitchens have already lit their fires. The farmers have already begun their chores. And now, it's our turn to travel. Not by carriage. Those were expensive. Not by some magnificent royal procession with silk banners waving dramatically in the wind. Those happen occasionally, but certainly not every Tuesday. Instead, we'll travel the way most medieval people did. Slowly. One foot after another. Modern maps make the world feel wonderfully small. Open your phone. Type a destination. A calm voice politely informs you to turn left in 300 meters. If only medieval Europe had been so considerate. Roads existed. Many of them followed ancient Roman routes that were already hundreds of years old. The Romans, whatever else one might say about them, had been remarkably enthusiastic road builders. Some of their roads remained usable centuries after the empire itself had disappeared. Quite an achievement. Many modern roads struggle to survive a particularly enthusiastic winter. Roman engineers would probably raise a thoughtful eyebrow. But not every road looked impressive. Far from it. Many were little more than worn tracks across fields. Mud during spring, dust during summer, deep ruts after heavy wagons passed. In winter, well, winter had its own opinions. Rain transformed roads into something halfway between a pathway and a determined swamp. Travelers occasionally spent more time rescuing wagons than actually moving them. A journey of 20 miles could become an all-day adventure, sometimes longer, not because people walked slowly, because the road insisted. Imagine setting out before sunrise. You tighten your wool cloak, adjust the leather strap, holding your small bag. Check that your walking staff is still where you left it. Good. You'd rather not discover that halfway through the forest. The air is cold enough to make each breath visible. Birds are beginning their morning conversations. A distant cow offers an opinion that nobody requested. Medieval cows appear to have been surprisingly confident. The village disappears behind you. Ahead lies open countryside, fields, forests, small streams, rolling hills, and somewhere beyond them, your destination. Perhaps, assuming you don't accidentally follow the wrong merchant for 3 hours. It happened, more often than anyone probably admitted. Travel required planning. Food had to be carried, water found, shelter arranged, money protected, shoes repaired. A good pair of boots might determine whether a journey became merely tiring or completely miserable. People often underestimate medieval footwear. A king could wear magnificent robes, but if his boots failed halfway across a muddy valley, he became remarkably similar to everyone else. History has an amusing habit of reminding powerful people that feet are democratic. Everyone has them. Everyone eventually complains about them. Let's meet one of the most familiar travelers in medieval Europe, the merchant, not necessarily rich, not necessarily poor, just constantly moving. Merchants connected kingdoms. They carried cloth from Flanders, salt from coastal regions, wine from France, spices arriving through Italy, fine glass, metal tools, leather goods, books, candles, wool, jewelry, news. Perhaps most importantly, they carried stories. Long before newspapers existed, merchants became walking information networks. A traveler arriving from Venice might know what had happened in Constantinople. Someone from Cologne might bring rumors from distant Denmark. Another from Spain could describe harvests in Castile. Not every story proved accurate. In fact, many improved considerably during the journey. Apparently, exaggeration also enjoys traveling. Picture a small roadside inn, not luxurious, just welcoming. A timber building beside the road, smoke rising gently from the chimney, a stable nearby. Inside, travelers gather around a long wooden table. One merchant discusses prices. Another complains about taxes. Someone else insists the roads used to be better. Older generations have apparently believed roads were better back then for at least 1,000 years. Some traditions refuse to disappear. The innkeeper serves thick stew, fresh bread, ale, perhaps cheese. Conversation drifts lazily from one subject to another. A wandering priest shares local news. A blacksmith discusses horseshoes. A merchant from Flanders describes unusually good cloth this season. Nobody realizes they're quietly exchanging information that will ripple across villages hundreds of miles apart. History often spreads through ordinary conversations, not just royal proclamations. Now let's travel with pilgrims. Unlike merchants, pilgrims usually journey for spiritual reasons. They visit holy places, shrines, cathedrals, monasteries, the tombs of saints. Some travel only a few days. Others spend months crossing Europe. A few travel astonishing distances, from England to Rome, from France to Santiago de Compostela, even from Northern Europe all the way toward Jerusalem before Crusades made such journeys increasingly dangerous. Walking became an act of devotion. Every mile carried religious meaning. Pilgrims often wore simple clothing, a broad hat, a walking staff, perhaps a scallop shell attached to the cloak if returning from Santiago. That shell became one of medieval Europe's most recognizable travel souvenirs, far more practical than a refrigerator magnet, especially considering medieval kitchens generally lacked refrigerators. Pilgrims rarely traveled entirely alone. Small groups naturally formed. Safety mattered. Companionship mattered. Conversations certainly helped pass endless hours on the road. Imagine walking 15 miles every day. Someone eventually begins telling stories. Old legends, Bible stories, local gossip, ghost tales, family memories, jokes, probably the same jokes every few days. Eventually, everyone politely laughs again anyway. Long journeys have always encouraged patience. Some roads wound through enormous forests. These forests inspired countless medieval legends, not because they were magical, although people certainly imagined they might be, mostly because forests were genuinely mysterious. Dense trees blocked sunlight. Strange sounds echoed between trunks. Paths disappeared unexpectedly. Wild animals lived there. Bandits occasionally did too. If you lost your way, finding it again wasn't always easy. Modern hikers carried GPS devices. Medieval travelers carried optimism. Sometimes that proved sufficient, sometimes not. Forests also supplied almost everything. Firewood, construction timber, wild berries, mushrooms, medicinal herbs, game animals, honey from wild bees. Entire communities depended upon nearby woodlands. Kings frequently claimed ownership of large forests, partly to protect hunting, partly to control valuable resources. Forest law became surprisingly complicated. You might legally gather fallen branches, but not cut living trees, or fish in one stream, but not another. The rules varied enormously. Medieval lawyers, much like modern ones, always seemed capable of producing another document. Let's quietly meet another remarkable traveler, Gerbert of Aurillac, later known as Pope Sylvester II. Before becoming pope around the year 999, Gerbert spent years studying mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. He traveled widely, learning from scholars in Christian and Islamic lands. He helped introduce improved mathematical knowledge into Western Europe, including the abacus. Numbers fascinated him. Astronomy fascinated him. Learning fascinated him. Unfortunately, extraordinary intelligence sometimes made ordinary people suspicious. Rumors eventually claimed Gerber possessed magical powers. Because apparently if someone understands mathematics exceptionally well, someone else eventually decides it must be wizardry. History has occasionally been rather unfair toward clever people. Education itself remained uncommon for most ordinary villagers, not because intelligence was rare. Opportunity was. Books cost fortunes. Teachers were limited. Schools existed mainly around monasteries and cathedrals. Most learning happened inside families. Parents taught children. Masters taught apprentices. Skills passed from one generation to another. Knowledge often lived in memory rather than libraries. A blacksmith didn't necessarily own books about iron. He understood iron because his father had taught him, who learned from his father before him. Some traditions stretch back centuries without ever touching parchment. Let's stop beside a bridge. Bridges became surprisingly important. A sturdy bridge transformed trade. Villages grew around them. Markets appeared. Travel became safer. Some bridges even supported tiny houses and shops. Imagine living directly above a river crossing. Every traveler passes beneath your window. You'd certainly hear plenty of gossip, perhaps rather more than desired. Bridge tolls also generated income. Someone almost always stood nearby collecting payment. Apparently, toll booths possess a very long history. Human civilization discovered taxes almost immediately after discovering roads. The weather quietly changes. Clouds gather. A gentle rain begins. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to remind everyone that wool cloaks become considerably heavier when wet. Travelers lower their heads. Horses continue patiently. Carts creak onward. Nobody particularly enjoys rain. Yet nobody appears surprised. The weather owes explanations to no one. Medieval life required accepting that simple fact. Sometimes sunshine arrived, sometimes rain, sometimes both before lunch. Complaining remained optional. The clouds ignore complaints anyway. As evening approaches, another village appears. Smoke curls upward from dozens of chimneys. Children play near a well. A blacksmith's hammer rings through the air. Someone bakes bread. Someone repairs a fence. Someone hangs freshly washed wool garments to dry. The traveler smiles quietly. Tonight there will be warmth, food, conversation, perhaps a straw mattress. After 20 miles on muddy roads, even straw begins looking surprisingly luxurious. And that's another quiet lesson the medieval world offers. Comfort often depends less on what you have and more on how tired you are. A simple bed after a long journey can feel like a royal chamber. A warm bowl of stew can rival a feast. A roof overhead can become the finest architecture in Europe. Tomorrow, we'll continue following these roads. They'll lead us toward bustling market towns, lively fairs, wandering entertainers, curious scholars, and kings whose kingdoms often seem much easier to rule on parchment than in reality, because the roads connected everything. Ideas, people, trade, faith, ambition, and occasionally one very stubborn mule refusing to cross an entirely respectable bridge for reasons known only to itself. Some mysteries of history remain unsolved. Morning arrives gently once again, not with fanfare, not with trumpets echoing across castle walls, just with soft light creeping over rooftops, the smell of fresh bread drifting into the streets, and a familiar chorus of carts whose wooden wheels somehow sound both exhausted and determined at exactly the same time. If you've been traveling with me through these quiet roads, you've probably noticed something. The medieval world was much less isolated than people often imagine. Villages talked to villages. Monasteries wrote to monasteries. Merchants crossed kingdoms. Pilgrims wandered astonishing distances. Ideas traveled, sometimes slowly, sometimes surprisingly fast. And nowhere did all those paths come together more completely than the market. So this morning, let's wander into one. Before we even reach the town gates, we can hear it. Not loud, just busy. 100 different conversations floating together. The steady clop of horses. A blacksmith's hammer striking iron somewhere nearby. The distant laugh of children who have already discovered something entertaining. Probably a goose. Geese have an extraordinary ability to become the center of attention. Whether they actually want that attention is another matter entirely. As we step through the gate, the street opens into a broad market square. Wooden stalls stand in long, uneven rows. Canvas awnings flap gently in the breeze. The smell is almost overwhelming. Fresh bread, smoked fish, honey, leather, wood shavings, cheese, beeswax candles, herbs drying in the sun, fresh apples, roasted onions, wet wool, a little horse, quite a lot of horse, actually, and somewhere nearby, someone has brought far too many sheep into a space, clearly designed for fewer sheep. The sheep seem unconcerned. Market day transformed an ordinary town into something resembling the heartbeat of an entire region. Farmers arrived before sunrise. Merchants unloaded wagons. Fishermen carried baskets packed with the morning's catch. Potters carefully arranged fragile bowls. Weavers displayed bolts of cloth. Woodworkers leaned carved furniture against their stalls. Every trade had its corner. Every corner had its own rhythm. Nobody stood still for very long, except perhaps the cats. The cats understood something about conserving energy that humanity has yet to fully appreciate. Unlike modern supermarkets, medieval markets involved conversation, constant conversation. Buying bread wasn't simply buying bread. It meant greeting the baker, asking about yesterday's weather, discussing the harvest, perhaps hearing the latest rumor about the local lord. You might arrive intending to purchase onions and leave 30 minutes later fully informed about 3 weddings, 1 boundary dispute, a traveling musician, and someone's cow that had apparently wandered into the monastery garden. Again, the cow clearly had spiritual ambitions. Coins changed hands carefully. Every single one mattered. Money itself could become surprisingly complicated. Different kingdoms minted different coins. Silver pennies, deniers, pfennigs, local currencies, foreign currencies. Merchants often carried small scales, not because they distrusted everyone, although they sometimes did, mostly because coins could be clipped, tiny pieces of silver shaved from the edges over time. One coin wasn't always exactly the same as another. Imagine buying vegetables while someone quietly weighs your money first. Shopping required considerably more mathematics than today. Most ordinary families rarely purchased enormous quantities of goods. Their income simply didn't allow it. Many people produced much of what they needed themselves. Bread, clothing, simple furniture, tools. But markets supplied the things difficult to make a home. Salt, iron, good knives, ceramic pots, needles, quality cloth, spices if you happen to possess remarkable wealth, or remarkable optimism. Salt deserves a quiet moment of appreciation. It sounds wonderfully ordinary. Today it's sitting in almost every kitchen. You probably haven't thought much about it recently. Medieval people certainly did. Salt preserved meat, preserved fish, made long winters survivable. Without refrigeration, preserving food became essential. A community with reliable access to salt enjoyed an enormous advantage. Entire trade routes developed around it. Cities became wealthy because of it. Wars occasionally involved it. History has repeatedly demonstrated that civilizations become strangely passionate about minerals. Gold, silver, salt. Humans are wonderfully consistent. Now, let's meet one of the busiest people in the market, the cloth merchant. Textiles formed one of medieval Europe's largest industries. Flanders became famous for wool cloth. Italian cities produced luxurious fabrics. English sheep quietly supported international trade simply by continuing to grow excellent wool. Imagine becoming economically important without ever realizing it. The sheep seemed blissfully unaware that they were helping shape European commerce. They mostly concentrated on grass, perhaps wisely. Making cloth required astonishing effort. First came the sheep, then shearing, cleaning the wool, carding it, spinning it into thread, weaving, fulling, dyeing, drying, finishing. Each step required skill. Entire families participated. Whole towns specialized in different stages. A simple wool cloak represented hundreds of hours of labor before anyone even wore it. Suddenly losing your favorite sweater feels significantly more understandable. Color mattered enormously. Bright colors announced wealth. Deep crimson required expensive dyes. Rich blue often depended upon woad or imported materials. Purple remained famously prestigious. Natural browns and grays appeared far more commonly among ordinary people, not because they lacked imagination, because brilliant colors cost money. Fashion has always quietly reflected economics. Across the square, the blacksmith continues working. Few people attracted more respect. Iron tools kept farms functioning. Horseshoes kept transportation moving. Nails built houses. Axes cleared forests. Knives prepared food. Locks protected valuables. The blacksmith rarely lacked customers. The forge glows orange. Bellows breathe steadily. Hammer meets iron with satisfying rhythm. Spark after spark leaps into the air. Children inevitably gather nearby to watch. Adults probably pretend they're supervising the children, but they seem equally fascinated. Molten metal has always possessed remarkable entertainment value. Blacksmiths often knew nearly everyone in town. They repaired tools, listened to complaints, heard local news, sometimes settled small arguments simply because people naturally gathered around the forge. Workshops became social spaces, much like cafes today, except considerably hotter and with fewer pastries. Probably. Now let's quietly visit another stall. The apothecary. Glass jars line wooden shelves. Bundles of dried herbs hang overhead. Little cloth bags contain mysterious powders. Small ceramic bottles hold oils. The smells blend together beautifully. Mint, lavender, rosemary, garlic, sage, honey, vinegar. Not every treatment worked. Some certainly did. Honey soothed wounds. Willow bark eased pain. Mint settled stomachs. Other remedies wandered into more imaginative territory. A headache might receive herbal tea. Reasonable enough. It might also receive carefully chosen gemstones. Less scientifically convincing. Yet medieval medicine deserves kindness rather than mockery. People worked with the knowledge available. Every generation does. Future centuries will probably smile gently at some of our own medical habits too. History encourages humility. Near the edge of the market, a storyteller has gathered a small crowd. No stage, no microphone, just a clear voice and an excellent memory. Stories remain one of humanity's oldest entertainments. Legends of King Arthur, stories of Charlemagne, local heroes, biblical tales, animal fables, comic adventures. Children sit closest. Adults pretend not to be listening. They're absolutely listening. Human beings have always loved good stories. That much never changes. The storyteller's voice rises and falls slowly. Hands gesture. Eyes widen. Someone laughs softly. For a few minutes, buying vegetables can wait. The carrots aren't going anywhere. Not far away, musicians tune simple instruments. A fiddle, a pipe, perhaps a small harp. Music drifts across the square. Nothing formal. Nothing rehearsed for concert halls. Just melodies people recognize. Songs learned from parents. Songs remembered from childhood. Tunes that somehow survived generations without ever being written down. Music traveled almost as efficiently as merchants. Sometimes even farther. Let's pause beside a bookseller. There aren't many books. Perhaps only a handful. Each represents extraordinary value. A beautifully copied psalter. A collection of prayers. A legal manuscript. Maybe a classical text copied in a monastery. Owning one book might cost more than several cows. Imagine choosing between building your library or purchasing livestock. The decision becomes rather different. No wonder books received such careful treatment. They weren't casually left open on rainy windowsills. As afternoon stretches onward, judges sometimes arrive. Market days often became legal days as well. Disputes settled, contracts witnessed, debts recorded, property transferred. The marketplace doubled as a courtroom. Justice happened in public. Neighbors watched. Everyone learned who owed whom. Embarrassment occasionally proved almost as persuasive as punishment. Communities remembered everything, sometimes rather too well. Let's quietly meet one remarkable medieval merchant city, Bruges. By the 13th century, it had become one of Europe's great commercial centers. Merchants from England, Italy, Germany, France, Scandinavia all arrived there. Ships filled its canals. Warehouses overflowed. Languages mixed in the streets. If you wanted to understand medieval trade, Bruges offered an excellent classroom. Success wasn't built through conquest. It grew through commerce. Patiently, one transaction at a time. As the sun begins lowering toward the western horizon, the market slowly changes. Stalls disappear one by one. Unsold vegetables return to carts. Cloth rolls carefully back into wagons. Animals gather for the journey home. Children reluctantly follow parents. The storyteller bows politely. The musicians pack away their instruments. The blacksmith finally lets his fire cool. The square grows quieter. Not empty, just peaceful again. Tomorrow will simply become an ordinary open space. Until the next market day transforms it once more. Perhaps that's the quiet magic of these medieval gatherings. For a few hours, the entire world seemed to arrive together. Kings ruled from distant castles. Monks prayed in silent monasteries. Farmers worked scattered fields. But here, everyone crossed paths. Ideas changed hands alongside bread. News traveled beside wool. Friendships formed beside fish stalls. Business mixed with gossip. Faith mixed with laughter. History itself quietly passed through the marketplace, wearing muddy boots and carrying a basket of onions. And somehow, that feels exactly right. So as evening settles over the rooftops and the last wagon disappears down the dusty road, we'll continue our journey next time. Ahead lies a fascinating world of medieval feasts, royal banquets, impossible table manners, curious food traditions, and noble households that spent astonishing fortunes trying to impress guests who probably just wanted another piece of bread. Because, despite everything, good food has always had a remarkable talent for bringing people together. The market has gone quiet. Its voices have drifted away with the merchants. The last wagon has disappeared over the hill. Only a few chickens remain in the square, conducting what appears to be a very serious inspection of crumbs. The chickens seem convinced they are in charge. Perhaps they are. History rarely records the opinions of poultry. Now the evening is settling across the countryside. Windows begin glowing with candlelight. Smoke rises from chimneys in slow blue ribbons. Families gather around simple meals. Some sit on rough wooden benches inside tiny cottages. Others dine within stone castles whose towers catch the final rays of the setting sun. Tonight, we're going somewhere rather grand. Not because grand places were necessarily happier, or cleaner, or even more comfortable. They simply had considerably larger dining tables. And medieval, nobles absolutely loved large dining tables. Because nothing says, I possess tremendous political influence, quite like requiring 47 people to pass you the salt. As we enter the castle's great hall, preparations are already well underway. Servants hurry in every direction. Candles are being lit one after another. Fresh rushes have been scattered across the floor. Long wooden tables stretch almost the entire length of the room. At the far end stands a high table, slightly elevated, slightly grander, reserved for the lord, the lady, honored guests, and anyone important enough to be seated where everyone else could admire or quietly judge them. Hierarchy existed everywhere in medieval society. Even dinner had a seating chart, and heaven helped the steward if someone accidentally placed a minor noble ahead of a major one. Entire diplomatic incidents have probably begun with less. The kitchen resembles organized chaos, or perhaps chaotic organization. It's difficult to tell. Enormous fireplaces blaze. Huge iron cauldrons bubble steadily. The chief cook moves through the room with astonishing confidence. He remembers dozens of dishes without consulting a single recipe. Young assistants chop herbs. Others carry fresh bread. Someone rotates an entire roast over the fire. Someone else has spent what feels like 3 hours arranging apples into a shape that vaguely resembles dignity. Presentation mattered. Very much. Nobles didn't simply eat. They performed eating. One thing surprises many modern visitors. Not every meal included mountains of meat. Popular imagination often pictures medieval feasts as endless towers of roasted animals. Reality was a little more balanced. Yes, wealthy nobles enjoyed beef, venison, pork, goose, swan on special occasions, pheasant, rabbit, and many other meats. But bread remained essential. So did vegetables, peas, beans, turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage. Herbs appeared constantly. Fresh fruit when available. Dried fruit during colder months. A banquet without bread would have seemed strangely incomplete. Bread wasn't simply food. It was a foundation upon which nearly everything else rested. Quite literally. Large slices of stale bread, called trenchers, often served as plates. Stew, roast meat, sauces, everything rested upon them. After the meal, these soaked trenchers might be eaten or given to servants or donated to the poor. An unexpectedly practical solution. Modern dishwashers suddenly seem rather less revolutionary. Now imagine the guests arriving. Rich wool cloaks, fur-lined collars, fine belts decorated with silver, beautiful embroidered sleeves, jewelry catching the candlelight. Conversation begins immediately. Politics, harvests, family news, marriage negotiations, border disputes, weather. Apparently, the weather has remained reliable small talk for at least a millennium. No civilization has yet escaped it. One guest quietly bows to another. Another embraces an old friend. Someone politely compliments a cloak, while secretly calculating exactly how expensive it must have been. Fashion has always inspired equal parts admiration and financial curiosity. The Lord enters. Everyone rises, not dramatically, simply as custom requires. The meal begins with a prayer. Religion gently frames almost every important moment in medieval life. Then comes the first course. Servants move with remarkable precision. One small mistake could become deeply embarrassing. Imagine dropping hot stew directly onto the visiting duke. There are careers that recover from such incidents. Medieval service was probably not one of them. Let's talk about forks. Or rather, their surprising absence. Most medieval Europeans did not regularly use forks at the dining table until much later. Knives? Certainly. Spoons? Absolutely. Forks? Less common. Many people simply use fingers. Carefully washed fingers, ideally. Good manners mattered enormously. You weren't expected to grab food like an enthusiastic bear discovering a picnic. There were rules. Always rules. Take modest portions. Don't stuff your mouth. Don't wipe greasy hands on the tablecloth. Don't drink before swallowing. Don't sneeze directly into the communal serving bowl. The last rule feels particularly timeless. One medieval etiquette book advised diners not to scratch themselves while eating. Another recommended avoiding blowing your nose into the tablecloth, which suggests, at some point, someone had apparently needed reminding. History occasionally reveals more about people than they intended. Now let's quietly meet Eleanor of Aquitaine again. Not on a battlefield, not negotiating alliances, simply hosting a court. Eleanor's household became famous for culture, poetry, music, conversation. The courts of southern France especially celebrated troubadours, traveling poets who composed songs about love, honor, adventure, longing, impossible romances. Occasionally they praised noble ladies with language so elaborate that modern greeting cards seem positively restrained. These performances entertained guests throughout long evenings. The melodies floated through candlelit halls while listeners quietly sipped wine. Not every royal evening involved political plotting. Sometimes people simply enjoyed good music, a surprisingly comforting thought. Wine itself deserves a brief visit. In southern Europe, wine formed an ordinary part of daily life. Northern regions often preferred ale. Both appeared at noble tables. Water certainly existed. Despite persistent myths, medieval people were perfectly capable of drinking water. The issue depended largely on local cleanliness. A fresh spring remained an excellent source. A stagnant ditch, rather less so. Common sense existed long before microbiology. People observed what tended to make them sick. They simply explained it differently. Now comes one of the banquet's greatest entertainments. The musicians that a harp begins softly, a flute joins, then perhaps a rebec, an early bowed instrument. Nothing overwhelming, just gentle music filling the spaces between conversation. Some guests barely notice. Others listen carefully. Children, if present, become fascinated by the performers, at least until dessert appears. Children across history have demonstrated remarkably consistent priorities. Then enters the jester. Not every castle employed one, but many noble households enjoyed entertainers. Modern films often portray jesters as endlessly shouting jokes. Reality could be subtler. Some told stories. Some sang. Some performed juggling tricks. Others offered clever observations about court life. Occasionally, they gently teased powerful nobles. Carefully, very carefully, making a king laugh could earn rewards. Making him angry, less desirable. Timing mattered, perhaps more than talent. Let's quietly visit another remarkable ruler, King Alfonso X of Castile, known as Alfonso the Wise, a nickname that immediately creates rather high expectations. Fortunately, he generally lived up to it. During the 13th century, Alfonso sponsored scholars, translators, musicians, astronomers, lawyers, and historians. His court became one of Europe's great centers of learning. Texts from Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin traditions were translated into Castilian. Knowledge crossed cultures. Ideas traveled. Astronomy flourished. Law codes expanded. Music collections were preserved. One ruler's curiosity quietly benefited generations, yet unborn. Sometimes the greatest legacy a king leaves isn't conquest. It's encouraging clever people to keep asking questions. The banquet continues. Course after course arrives. Not because everyone eats enormous amounts, although some certainly try. Hospitality required generosity. A noble host demonstrated wealth by ensuring guests never worried about empty plates. To leave hungry might imply the host lacked resources. Social expectations occasionally become expensive. Between courses, servants refill cups. Fresh candles replace dying ones. Dogs wander beneath the tables, hoping gravity continues behaving normally. It usually does. Some fortunate dog somewhere receives an unexpected piece of roasted meat. History rarely records his happiness. We can safely imagine it. Conversation drifts toward hunting. One noble describes an especially magnificent stag. Another quietly doubles the size of his own previous stag. The first noble notices. He politely triples his. Storytelling has always benefited from modest exaggeration. By the end of the evening, someone has probably encountered the largest deer in recorded history. Curiously, no one seems entirely convinced. Yet everyone enjoys the story anyway. As the hours pass, the hall grows warmer. Candles flicker. Firelight dances across carved wooden beams. Outside, the castle courtyard falls silent beneath the stars. Inside, laughter remains gentle, noisy enough to feel alive, quiet enough to remain peaceful. Eventually, guests begin retiring. Some climb narrow spiral staircases carrying candles. Others remain talking beside the fire. Servants quietly begin clearing tables. The great hall slowly transforms once again. Tomorrow morning, it will host legal meetings, tax records, petitions, political discussions. Tonight, it was simply a place where people gathered to eat together. And perhaps that's something medieval life understood rather well. Meals weren't merely about food. They were about relationships, trust, conversation, community. Even kings needed companions at the table. Even queens enjoyed listening to music after long days of responsibility. Even the busiest servants paused eventually to share bread with one another in the kitchens. Food filled stomachs. Shared meals quietly held societies together. As the final candles burn low and sleepy silence settles across the castle, we'll leave the hall behind. Tomorrow we'll visit one of the most fascinating places in medieval Europe, the royal bedchamber, a place far less private than anyone today would expect. A room where births, deaths, diplomacy, arguments, celebrations, illness, and sometimes the fate of entire kingdoms unfolded beside a very ordinary bed. Because in the Middle Ages, even sleep could become a matter of state. The banquet is over now. The last guests have wandered toward their chambers with candles held carefully against the darkness. The musicians have packed away their instruments. The great hall, which only an hour ago echoed with conversation, now sits almost silent. Only a few servants remain. One sweeps the rushes from the floor. Another stacks wooden trenchers. Someone carefully covers the remaining bread for tomorrow morning. The enormous fireplaces settle into glowing beds of red coals. Outside, the castle sleeps. Well, most of it, because castles never truly slept. Someone always stood watch on the walls. Someone remained awake in the kitchens. Stable boys checked nervous horses. Guards paced along cold battlements beneath a sky crowded with stars. And somewhere inside these thick stone walls, the king is preparing for bed, which, oddly enough, is not a private moment, not even close. Today, the bedroom is perhaps the most private room in a house. You close the door. That's generally the end of the story. A medieval royal bedchamber worked rather differently. The bedroom functioned as an office, a reception room, a council chamber, sometimes even a courtroom. Important visitors arrived there. Government documents were signed there. Private meetings took place there. Trusted advisors entered freely. Servants came and went almost constantly. Privacy existed, but in much smaller quantities than we would recognize today. The king might discuss taxes while sitting beside his bed. A foreign ambassador could be received before breakfast. A bishop might arrive with urgent news. A physician might examine a fever. All in the same room. The bed simply happened to be there. Imagine answering work emails while someone simultaneously changes your bed sheets. That begins to capture the atmosphere. The royal bed itself was an astonishing piece of furniture. Massive wooden frames, heavy carved posts, rich curtains surrounding the mattress, blankets layered one upon another, wool, linen, perhaps fur during winter. These curtains weren't merely decorative. They trapped warmth. Stone castles remained chilly for much of the year. Sleeping inside thick curtains created a smaller pocket of warmer air. Rather clever, really. Sometimes practical solutions also happened to look luxurious. Mattresses themselves were filled with straw, or feathers if you possess extraordinary wealth. Feather mattresses became genuine status symbols. Imagine proudly telling visitors, "Our bed contains goose feathers." It sounds oddly specific, yet in the medieval world, it quietly announced considerable prosperity. Comfort has always been relative. Candles burned softly around the room. Not too many. Wax remained expensive. Most households relied heavily on tallow candles made from animal fat. They worked perfectly well, although they smoked more, and the smell could politely be described as memorable. Beeswax candles burned cleaner. They smelled pleasant. They also cost considerably more. Even lighting reflected social class. History has a remarkable talent for replacing status into absolutely everything. Let's quietly meet another king, Edward the Confessor. He ruled England from 1042 until 1066. A thoughtful ruler, deeply religious, reserved. Contemporaries describe him as unusually pious. His reputation eventually became so strong that the church declared him a saint. Edward preferred peace whenever possible, an admirable quality, although governing ambitious nobles occasionally required rather more than admirable intentions. His court became known for elaborate ceremony, careful etiquette, religious devotion. The magnificent Westminster Abbey largely owes its origins to Edward's vision. He never saw the dramatic events that followed his death, perhaps just as well. History sometimes closes one chapter moments before opening another. Edward's bedchamber became one of the kingdom's most important political spaces. Trusted advisors entered. Officials delivered reports. Petitions arrived. Foreign envoys waited patiently. Royal authority often felt surprisingly personal. Government happened wherever the king happened to be. If the king moved, government moved. Imagine relocating an entire administrative system every few weeks. Because medieval courts traveled constantly, many kings disliked remaining in one castle for too long, partly for political reasons. Subjects appreciated seeing their ruler. partly for practical reasons. Feeding several hundred members of the royal household rapidly exhausted local supplies. Moving elsewhere allowed one estate to recover, while another provided food. The medieval solution to logistics often involved simply relocating the entire palace. No small undertaking. Picture hundreds of horses, dozens of wagons, furniture, books, clothing, kitchen equipment, priests, servants, dogs, falcons, officials, children, perhaps an especially grumpy goose. Everything packed, everything unpacked, then packed again a few weeks later. Modern moving companies might quietly refuse the contract. Now, let's visit the Queen's chamber. Despite being nearby, it often functioned independently. Queens maintained their own households, their own servants, their own finances, their own responsibilities. Powerful queens supervised enormous estates, managed correspondence, oversaw education, arranged marriages, distributed charity, received visitors, supported monasteries. Their work rarely ended. History sometimes presents queens as decorative companions beside kings. Reality was considerably busier. Many effectively governed large portions of royal administration. Quiet competence rarely receives dramatic movie scenes. Yet, kingdoms depended upon it. Childbirth made the Queen's chamber one of the most significant rooms in Europe. An entire dynasty could depend upon what happened there. Royal births attracted astonishing attention. Midwives, ladies-in-waiting, physicians, clergy, family members. Everyone hoped for healthy mothers, healthy babies, preferably sons, although daughters often became equally valuable through diplomacy. Every birth carried enormous emotional weight, not simply for parents, but for kingdoms. Succession remained one of medieval politics' greatest concerns. A single infant might alter the future of Europe before learning to walk. Rather, a lot of responsibility for someone mostly interested in sleeping. Infant mortality remained heartbreakingly high throughout the Middle Ages. Many families lost children, rich and poor alike. Kings mourned sons. Farmers mourned daughters. Disease rarely respected crowns. Understanding that shared vulnerability reminds us how deeply human these historical figures truly were. Behind the magnificent robes lived parents hoping their children would simply grow up, a hope that remains universal. Royal children often occupied separate households surprisingly early. Nurses cared for infants. Tutors instructed older children. Masters-at-arms trained young princes. Ladies supervised princesses. Education began young, very young. A future king might start learning Latin before many modern children begin elementary school. Not because childhood disappeared. Children still played, still laughed, still climbed things adults preferred they wouldn't climb. Some behaviors survive every century. Let's meet Empress Theophanu, one of medieval Europe's most remarkable women. Born into the Byzantine Empire around 960, she married Otto II, Holy Roman Emperor. Her arrival in Western Europe introduced Byzantine customs, art, fashion, and ceremony. After Otto's death, she governed as regent for their young son, and she governed exceptionally well. Diplomacy, administration, court management. Theophanu handled them all with remarkable skill. She reminds us that medieval Europe wasn't isolated into neat little kingdoms. Ideas crossed borders constantly. So did people. A princess from Constantinople could quietly reshape politics hundreds of miles away. History often travels wearing wedding clothes. The Byzantine court itself possessed extraordinary ceremony. Visitors described dazzling silk garments, golden mosaics, intricate etiquette, endless formal rituals. Some Western Europeans found it astonishingly sophisticated. Others found it slightly overwhelming. Imagine accidentally bowing 1 second too early. Court etiquette could become remarkably stressful. Fortunately, most ordinary people never faced such problems. Their greatest concern remained whether tomorrow's bread would rise properly, perhaps the healthier priority. Now the castle grows quieter. The servants extinguish unnecessary candles. Heavy wooden doors close. Iron bolts slide into place. Outside the walls, wolves occasionally howl in distant forests. Inside, guards continue their slow patrols. The king finally settles beneath thick blankets. The queen whispers one last conversation with her attendants. Children sleep. Dogs curl beside fireplaces. Somewhere high above, an owl glides silently across the moonlit sky. Yet even now, the castle isn't entirely asleep. In a small room lit by one lonely candle, a royal clerk continues copying tomorrow's letters. A physician studies herbal remedies. A monk visiting the court finishes evening prayers. A baker quietly prepares dough that must rise before dawn. History keeps moving, even while people rest. Perhaps especially then, because tomorrow morning the castle will awaken once more. The fires will be lit. The kitchens will fill with noise. Messengers will arrive carrying fresh news. Petitions will pile onto wooden tables. Children will begin lessons. Kings will make promises. Nobles will argue. Servants will work harder than anyone else. And somewhere, someone will once again insist that this particular disagreement over 2 fields and 1 unusually stubborn cow is surely the most important issue facing the entire kingdom. Remarkably, someone will probably be right, because history is rarely made only by great battles. Often, it grows quietly from ordinary rooms. A bedroom, a kitchen, a chapel, a stable, a nursery, the places where people live their everyday lives. So let the castle settle into peaceful silence. The candles are nearly gone. The moon hangs high above the towers. The castle is quiet now, not completely silent. Castles never achieve true silence. Somewhere, a guard shifts his weight against a spear. A horse stamps softly inside the stable. The kitchen fire gives one last sleepy crackle before settling into glowing embers. Outside, a cool wind slips across the battlements. The moon slowly makes its journey across the sky. Inside the nursery, however, another world continues. Because babies, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, have never cared very much about schedules, not even royal ones. A prince may have been destined to inherit half a continent. A princess might someday become queen of another kingdom. Neither was especially concerned about diplomacy at 3 o'clock in the morning. Both mainly wished to announce their existence at impressive volume. Some traditions truly are timeless. When we picture medieval royalty, we usually imagine adults, kings wearing crowns, queens dressed in embroidered silk, princes riding magnificent horses. But every one of them began exactly the same way. Tiny, fragile, entirely dependent on the adults around them. The future of kingdoms often rested inside a cradle no larger than a modern coffee table. That thought alone would have made almost every court slightly nervous. And indeed, they usually were. Royal births were followed with enormous interest, not because babies themselves understood anything about politics. They certainly didn't, but because everyone else did. One healthy child could prevent decades of civil war. One unexpected illness could throw an entire kingdom into uncertainty. Succession was medieval Europe's favorite political obsession, and unfortunately, it was often justified. Let's quietly step into the royal nursery. The room feels warmer than much of the castle. Extra fireplaces burn here. Heavy curtains block chilly drafts. Wooden cradles stand beside carefully carved furniture. Nurses move softly through the room. Everything feels surprisingly ordinary. There are blankets folded neatly. Small linen shirts drying near the fire. Simple wooden toys resting on the floor. A carved horse. A tiny rattle. Perhaps a cloth doll. History has preserved examples of medieval toys remarkably similar to those children still enjoy today. What remains wonderfully timeless. Royal children rarely stayed alone with their parents all day. Large households helped raise them. Wet nurses often cared for infants. Ladies supervised daily routines. Experienced attendants watched constantly. Not because parents lacked affection. Far from it. The practical demands of royal life simply required many helping hands. Queens managed enormous responsibilities. Kings governed kingdoms. Trusted household members became extended family in every meaningful sense. Some children grew deeply attached to their nurses. Letters written decades later sometimes reveal genuine affection. History occasionally surprises us with quiet tenderness. Infancy remained dangerous, very dangerous. Modern medicine has transformed childhood in ways difficult to fully appreciate. Medieval families, regardless of wealth, live with uncertainty. Fevers, infections, accidents, diseases that today are easily treated often became life-threatening. Even the richest rulers could do little more than hope, pray, and wait. Perhaps that's why medieval parents celebrated healthy childhood so deeply. Every birthday represented something genuinely precious. As children grew older, education began almost immediately. Princes did not spend their days simply running through gardens pretending to fight dragons, although they probably did that occasionally. And honestly, who could blame them? But lessons arrived early. Latin, religion, reading, writing, history, law, genealogy, court etiquette, military theory, music, hunting, falconry, diplomacy, conversation. A future king required astonishingly broad knowledge, at least in theory. Reality occasionally produced rulers who paid rather less attention during lessons. Teachers have been sighing quietly for centuries. Princesses received equally serious education, though often focused differently. They learned reading, religion, household management, languages, music, embroidery, estate administration, diplomatic etiquette. Many became remarkably capable managers of enormous noble households. Running a medieval castle required extraordinary organizational skill. Food supplies, servants, finances, guests, medical care, religious obligations. Everything demanded attention. The lady of the household frequently directed much of it. History has often underestimated just how much administrative talent noble women possessed. Let's meet one extraordinary child, Richard the Lionheart, born in 1157. Today his nickname makes him sound permanently fearless. One almost imagines him emerging from infancy already carrying a sword. Reality, naturally, proved rather different. Richard spent much of his childhood in Aquitaine under the influence of his remarkable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. He learned poetry, music, languages, courtly customs. Southern French culture shaped him deeply. He became an excellent poet in his own right, something many people forget. History tends to remember Richard charging into battle. Less often does it remember him composing elegant verses. Human beings rarely fit neatly inside their most famous nickname. Richard's relationship with his father, Henry II, became increasingly complicated, then strained, then openly hostile. Eventually, Richard joined rebellions against his own father. Not exactly the family bonding activity Henry probably imagined. The Plantagenet household possessed astonishing levels of internal disagreement. One historian joked that they treated civil war almost like a seasonal tradition. That may exaggerate matters slightly, only slightly. Meanwhile, Richard's younger brother John watched everything. Quietly, carefully. John rarely expected to become king. His older brother stood ahead of him. History, however, enjoys rearranging expectations. Deaths, accidents, politics, unexpected events gradually carried John toward the throne. The youngest child unexpectedly inheriting enormous responsibility is a story almost every generation seems to produce. Sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. We'll spend a peaceful evening with King John later. He deserves one, preferably after everyone has become comfortably sleepy. Childhood games look surprisingly familiar. Balls made from leather, hoops, toy swords, simple dolls, dice, board games. Children chase one another through castle courtyards exactly as children still chase one another through parks today. Adults occasionally shouted reminders. Not there. Be careful. Please don't climb that. Some phrases apparently never leave civilization. Animals fascinated children, then just as they do now. Castle dogs became favorite companions. Cats hunted mice through kitchens. Falcons attracted endless curiosity. Ponies introduced noble children to riding. A young prince learning horsemanship usually began with patient instructors and remarkably patient horses. Fortunately, because small children and large horses occasionally hold very different opinions regarding direction. Education often happened outdoors. Teachers walked through gardens discussing philosophy. Priests explained Bible stories beneath trees. Masters at arms supervised riding in open fields. Nature itself became part of the classroom. Learning wasn't always confined inside stone walls. Perhaps fresh air helped difficult lessons settle more comfortably into memory. Modern students might approve. Let's quietly meet another remarkable royal child, St. Louis, later King Louis IX of France, born in 1214. His mother, Blanche of Castile, played an enormous role in his upbringing. She emphasized justice, religion, compassion, duty. According to later accounts, she famously told him she would rather see him dead than committing mortal sin, a rather dramatic expression of parental expectations. Modern family counselors might gently recommend different wording. The underlying message, however, reflected genuine concern for moral character. Blanche proved an extraordinarily capable regent while Louis remained young. She defended the kingdom, managed rebellious nobles, protected the throne. Her son eventually became one of medieval Europe's most admired kings. Much credit belongs to the education she carefully supervised. Parents have quietly shaped history far more often than monuments suggest. Not every royal child enjoyed happiness. Some grew up surrounded by political tension. Hostages exchanged between rival families. Children sent abroad for diplomatic marriages. Young heirs living under constant expectation. Imagine knowing before your 10th birthday that thousands of people expected you to rule them someday. Rather heavy thoughts for someone still trying to remember Latin grammar. Royal childhood carried privileges. It also carried remarkable pressure. Ordinary village children experienced very different lives. Many began helping parents early, watching younger siblings, gathering firewood, fetching water, learning trades. Yet even amid responsibility, play found its place. Children invented games from almost anything. Sticks became swords. Stones became castles. Streams became oceans. Imagination requires remarkably few resources. That may be one of humanity's greatest talents. Medieval parents clearly loved their children. Old letters reveal concern during illness, joy at recovery, deep grief after loss. For centuries, some historians mistakenly assumed medieval families formed weaker emotional bonds because death remained common. Modern scholarship strongly disagrees. The evidence points in another direction entirely. Parents mourned deeply. Children missed parents. Families celebrated births. They worried. They hoped. They laughed together. Human affection has never depended upon the century. As dawn slowly approaches once more, the nursery finally grows still. The baby prince sleeps peacefully. The little princess curls beneath warm blankets. The nurse quietly mends a tiny linen shirt beside fading candlelight. Outside, the first birds begin singing. Another medieval day prepares to begin. Soon the tutors will arrive. The riding lessons will begin. The Latin books will open. The castle corridors will fill with footsteps. Somewhere, one future king will secretly wish today's lesson involved more archery and considerably less grammar, a feeling that countless students across history would immediately understand, because before they became famous, before the crowns, before the wars, before the legends, every king and queen was simply a child trying to understand a very complicated world. And perhaps that is one of the most comforting truths history quietly offers us. The greatest names in medieval Europe once needed help tying their shoes, or whatever the medieval equivalent happened to be. The castle is awake once more. Morning sunlight pours through narrow windows, tracing pale golden lines across worn stone floors. Somewhere below us, the kitchen has already begun baking bread. The smell rises through the stairwells long before breakfast is served. A blacksmith's hammer echoes faintly from outside the walls. Stable boys are brushing horses. The chapel bell has already rung. Servants hurry through corridors carrying baskets, buckets, folded linen, and messages that someone important insists absolutely cannot wait another 5 minutes. Life has resumed its familiar rhythm. And today, We'll follow the children we left sleeping in the nursery, because childhood, at least for medieval nobles, never lasted very long, not in the modern sense. By the age of 7, many noble boys had already begun leaving home, not forever, but for training, education, preparation, the long process of becoming the sort of adult their family expected, which, depending on the family, could be an extraordinary opportunity or an extraordinary burden, usually both. Imagine being 7 years old. You're still fascinated by dogs. You still enjoy chasing chickens through the courtyard. You still occasionally forget where you left your shoes. Then one morning you're told you'll be traveling to another lord's castle, not because you've done anything wrong. Quite the opposite. You're beginning your education. Your parents hug you goodbye. Your horse seems suspiciously taller than yesterday. Your nurse quietly wipes away tears. You probably do the same once nobody is watching. History rarely pauses to describe these little emotional moments, yet they must have happened. Children have always missed home. Parents have always worried after waving goodbye. No century has ever escaped that. A young noble boy usually became a page. This sounds rather modest. In reality, it marked the first step toward knighthood. The page entered another noble household, sometimes that of a relative, sometimes a political ally, sometimes an important lord whom the family hoped to impress. The arrangement benefited everyone. The boy received training. The host gained another helpful member of the household. Political friendships quietly strengthened. Education and diplomacy often walked hand in hand. A page's day began early, very early. Much like everyone else's in the medieval world, there were beds to make, rooms to tidy, messages to carry, meals to serve, weapons to clean, horses to observe. Older knights expected discipline, good manners, attention, reliability. Learning happened constantly, not through lectures alone, but through observation. A page watched how experienced nobles greeted visitors, how they negotiated, how they treated servants, how they behaved during church services, how they sat at dinner. Even something as ordinary as handing a cup to a guest carried lessons about courtesy. Growing into a nobleman required mastering hundreds of tiny customs. None seemed especially important alone. Together, they defined an entire social world. Of course, there was physical training. Lots of it. Running, wrestling, swimming, horse riding, archery, handling practice weapons. No 7-year-old received a massive steel sword. That would have ended badly, very badly. Instead, wooden practice swords appeared. Smaller bows, lighter equipment, skills developed gradually. The image of tiny boys clanking around in miniature armor is charming. Reality remained rather more sensible. Thankfully, let's quietly meet one of history's greatest knights, William Marshall. If medieval Europe had collected sports trophies for chivalry, William might have needed an extra castle simply to store them. Born around 1146 into a family of modest nobility, William's future initially looked uncertain. He wasn't expected to inherit much land. As a younger son, he needed another path. Knighthood became that path. His childhood training proved intense, patient, demanding. Everything changed through steady effort rather than sudden brilliance, which feels surprisingly modern. As a young boy, William served as a page in another household, exactly as countless noble children did. He learned discipline, etiquette, horsemanship, service. Eventually, he became a squire. The next step, squiring meant much greater responsibility. He cared for a knight's armor, prepared horses, maintained weapons, accompanied his master everywhere. Imagine carrying heavy equipment for someone while simultaneously trying to learn everything they know. A challenging apprenticeship, yet remarkably effective. Observation remains one of humanity's oldest teachers. William's later career became almost legendary. He competed successfully in hundreds of tournaments, not the gentle sporting events modern audiences sometimes imagine. Early tournaments resembled enormous mock battles spread across entire landscapes. Dangerous, chaotic, exhausting. Knights charged across fields pursuing one another for miles. Capturing opponents could earn valuable ransoms. Success required courage, skill, excellent horses, and perhaps a little luck. History occasionally rewards preparation. It also occasionally rewards being in exactly the right place when everyone else becomes wonderfully confused. William seemed unusually talented at both. Eventually, William Marshall served 5 English kings. 5. Think about that for a moment. Most careers involve adapting to one difficult manager. William successfully navigated 5 entirely different monarchs. Henry II, young Henry, Richard the Lionheart, King John, Henry III. Each possessed different personalities, different priorities, different tempers. William somehow earned respect from all of them. That may actually be his greatest achievement. Now let's return to our young page. After morning lessons comes riding practice. The stable yard feels wonderfully alive. Horses snort softly. Leather saddles creak. Sunlight catches bits of floating dust. An older instructor patiently explains balance, control, gentle hands. A horse notices immediately whether its rider feels nervous. Some horses politely forgive beginners. Others quietly test them, much like experienced school teachers. The clever ones always know exactly who prepared for class. Falconry also fascinated noble households. Imagine standing perfectly still while a magnificent hawk rests calmly upon your gloved arm. The bird weighs surprisingly little. Its eyes miss almost nothing. Training birds of prey demanded patience measured in months, perhaps years. A well-trained falcon represented prestige, skill, partnership between human and animal. Medieval nobles admired these birds enormously. And honestly, once you look closely into the eyes of a peregrine falcon, it's rather easy to understand why. Education wasn't limited to boys. Young noble women received equally careful preparation, although focused toward different future responsibilities. Let's visit a lady's chamber on this quiet morning. Several girls sit beside large windows where the light is strongest. Embroidery hoops rest in their hands. At first glance, it seems simple, decorative even. In reality, embroidery required extraordinary precision, steady hands, careful planning, excellent eyesight, complex patterns. The finest embroidered garments represented hundreds upon hundreds of hours of skilled work. Needlework became both practical skill and artistic expression. Many medieval masterpieces survive today because patient hands stitched them one careful thread at a time. The famous Bayeux tapestry, although technically an embroidery rather than a tapestry, reminds us just how sophisticated these skills became. Stretching nearly 70 meters, it tells the story of the Norman conquest through hundreds of embroidered figures. Kings, ships, horses, soldiers, comets, dogs, even tiny details of daily life. It's almost like watching an illustrated documentary created 9 centuries ago, except every frame had to be stitched by hand. One can only admire the patience involved. Music filled noble education too. Harps, lutes, small flutes. Singing, a refined chord appreciated graceful conversation, poetry, and music almost as much as martial skill. The ideal noble wasn't simply expected to fight well. He or she should also speak well, listen well, read, pray, negotiate, entertain guests, manage estates, understand law, recognize family alliances, remember names, and somehow still remain pleasant during dinner. Expectations were ambitious. Languages mattered enormously. Latin remained the language of scholarship and the church. French dominated many noble courts after the Norman conquest. Local languages continued thriving among ordinary people. A well-educated noble often switched comfortably between several languages depending upon the audience. Modern multilingual professionals might quietly recognize the challenge. Books slowly became more common among wealthy families. Still precious, still expensive, but increasingly available. Children practiced reading from beautifully copied manuscripts. Margins sometimes contained playful illustrations, tiny animals, curious faces, decorative vines. Even serious education occasionally included moments of whimsy. Teachers throughout history have understood that attention wanders. A cheerful rabbit hiding in the margin probably helped. Afternoons often included hunting lessons, not merely for sport. Hunting taught tracking, observation, patience, leadership, knowledge of forests, knowledge of animals, teamwork. Managing hunting dogs alone required remarkable organization. The forest itself became another classroom, quiet, green, filled with lessons for anyone willing to notice them. Not every lesson proved enjoyable. Genealogy certainly didn't. Imagine memorizing family trees, stretching back generations. Who married whom? Which cousin inherited which castle? Which aunt connected your family to another powerful dynasty? Which branch had unfortunately argued with another branch 3 decades ago? One forgotten ancestor could accidentally create a diplomatic embarrassment. Family history mattered a great deal. As evening approaches, the castle gradually quiets once again. Young pages polish borrowed armor before returning it. Girls carefully fold embroidery into wooden chests. Tutors close heavy books. Stable masters check horses one final time. The day's lessons have ended. For now, tomorrow, they begin again, day after day, season after season, until these children become adults carrying responsibilities their younger selves could barely imagine. Some will inherit castles. Some will enter monasteries. Some will marry into distant kingdoms. Some will become famous. Many will quietly disappear into history. Yet tonight, they're simply tired children hoping tomorrow's writing lesson might be a little shorter and tomorrow's Latin lesson perhaps mysteriously canceled. A hope shared by students across every century. And perhaps that's why these stories still feel familiar. Beneath all the titles, all the ceremony, all the velvet and steel, another morning unfolds over the medieval countryside. The mist still clings to the low fields. Tiny drops of dew sparkle on blades of grass. The castle is already awake, of course. It always is. Someone is feeding horses. Someone is carrying firewood. Someone has already started arguing about grain deliveries. A clerk has misplaced an important document. Or perhaps he knows exactly where it is, and everyone else simply failed to read the labels. That possibility exists too. History is surprisingly full of misplaced paperwork. The village beyond the castle walls, however, feels different today. People are smiling. Not everyone. There was always someone worrying about something. But there's a certain lightness in the air. Children are finishing chores unusually quickly. Women are baking more bread than usual. Men have washed their best tunics. Even the old village dog seems to sense that today will be different. Because today is a feast day. And for one precious day, the endless rhythm of ordinary work pauses. Not completely. Animals still need feeding. Bread still needs baking. Fires still need tending. Life never entirely stops. But it slows. Just enough for people to breathe. Just enough to remember that life was meant to contain joy as well as labor. The medieval calendar contained astonishing numbers of feast days. Modern people often imagine medieval life as endless work with almost no rest. The reality is rather more balanced. Religious festivals filled the year. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the feasts of local saints, harvest celebrations, market festivals, town anniversaries, royal celebrations. Some historians estimate that in certain periods, nearly 1/3 of the year included some form of religious holiday or festival. Not every celebration meant a complete day free from labor, but many significantly reduced ordinary work. Even the busiest farmer occasionally received permission to breathe. Church bells announce the morning. Their sound rolls gently across fields and forests. Entire villages begin walking toward the parish church. The roads fill with familiar faces. Neighbors greet one another. Children race ahead despite repeated instructions not to. Older villagers walk more slowly, discussing whether that everyone has already experienced together. Conversation comes easily. People who have shared the same field for decades rarely struggle to find common topics. The church itself stands at the center of village life, not merely spiritually, socially as well. Announcements happen here. Marriages begin here. Funerals end here. Disputes sometimes settle here. News spreads here. A traveler arriving with information from another county often shares it after Mass. The building belongs to everyone, rich, poor, young, old. For a little while, social divisions soften, not disappear, simply soften. Everyone stands beneath the same roof. Everyone hears the same prayers. Everyone returns to the same sunlight afterward. Today's service lasts a little longer than usual. There are additional hymns, extra candles, flowers arranged around the altar. Children fidget. Parents quietly encourage patience. Some things transcend centuries with remarkable determination. Eventually, the final blessing is given. People step outside, and almost immediately, the celebration truly begins. The village green transforms completely. Only yesterday it was an ordinary patch of grass. Today it resembles a fairground. Simple wooden stalls appear. A brewer has brought fresh ale. A baker displays sweet buns flavored with honey. Someone roasts meat over an open fire. Children gather around a storyteller already halfway through an exciting tale involving a dragon that seems suspiciously similar to last month's dragon. No one minds. Good stories improve with repetition. Music arrives before long. One piper, then another. A drummer joins. Soon the square fills with simple melodies everyone recognizes. Nobody announces that dancing may begin. It simply happens. An older couple starts first. Young people quickly follow. Children imitate, everyone with enthusiastic inaccuracy. The musicians smile quietly. They've seen this countless times before. Every festival follows a familiar rhythm. Different faces, same happiness. Medieval dancing looked rather different from modern social dancing. Many dances involved circles, lines, groups moving together, steps repeated patiently. Nothing especially complicated. The goal wasn't dazzling strangers. It was participation, community, shared rhythm. One slightly clumsy dancer mattered far less than one absent dancer. Everyone belonged. Let's quietly meet the minstrel. Not quite a noble, not quite a peasant. Traveling entertainers occupied fascinating positions in medieval society. They carried songs between regions, stories between kingdoms, news disguised as entertainment. One evening they might perform in a castle, the next in a village square, then perhaps at a monastery. Their audiences constantly changed. So did their material. A clever minstrel knew exactly which stories pleased nobles and which delighted farmers. Flexibility has always been excellent job security. Many songs celebrated legendary heroes. King Arthur, Roland, Charlemagne, Robin Hood would gradually join popular tradition later. These stories changed slightly with every telling. One singer emphasized bravery. Another preferred romance. A third quietly inserted jokes about local officials. Audiences appreciated all three. Written literature remained precious. Spoken storytelling remained wonderfully alive. Every performance became unique. Gone once finished, living only in memory. Now, let's wander toward the games. Medieval festivals loved competitions. Archery contests, wrestling, running races, throwing stones, balancing contests. Even games involving barrels, sticks, or surprisingly determined geese. Human creativity has always flourished whenever free time appears. Some games rewarded strength. Others rewarded precision. Many rewarded simple good fortune. Children usually invented additional rules halfway through. Adults pretended not to notice. One contest draws particular attention. The longbow competition. In England especially, archery became extraordinarily important. Kings actively encouraged practice, sometimes required it. A skilled archer represented valuable military strength. Training began young. Festival contests therefore served two purposes: entertainment and practice, a remarkably efficient combination. The targets stand at impressive distances. One by one, arrows whistle through the air. The crowd applauds good shots, politely ignores poor ones. Mostly, friendly teasing inevitably appears. It always does. Nearby, craftsmen proudly display their finest work. A cooper exhibits beautifully made barrels. A carpenter shows carved chairs. The village blacksmith has polished several exceptionally handsome knives. Potters arrange glazed bowls beneath the sunlight. These displays aren't merely about selling goods. They're about reputation. A respected craftsman rarely needed elaborate advertising. Satisfied neighbors provided plenty. Word of mouth has always been powerful. Long before the internet. Long before newspapers. Long before business cards. Good work quietly traveled through conversation. Let's visit the food, because festivals and food have maintained a close friendship throughout history. Ordinary meals remained simple. Festival meals became opportunities. Fresh bread, cheese, roasted pork if available, pies filled with apples or berries, honey cakes, nuts, ale, perhaps wine in wealthier communities. Nothing impossibly extravagant. Simply more generous than usual. Sharing mattered as much as eating. Nobody enjoyed celebrating alone, at least not for very long. Children run through the crowd holding little wooden toys purchased from traveling craftsmen. Tiny horses, whistles carved into the shape of birds, simple spinning tops. Parents smile despite quietly calculating whether another toy will somehow become absolutely necessary before sunset. Parenthood appears remarkably consistent across history. Let's quietly visit one of medieval Europe's great annual events, the Champagne fairs in France. Beginning in the 12th century, these enormous commercial gatherings attracted merchants from across Europe, Italian bankers, English wool traders, Flemish cloth merchants, German metalworkers, Spanish traders. The fairs combined commerce with celebration, business by day, entertainment by evening, music, storytelling, feasting. Ideas moved as freely as merchandise. Entire economic networks quietly depended upon these gatherings. As afternoon drifts onward, traveling performers begin arriving. Jugglers toss brightly colored balls. Acrobats balance upon ropes. Animal trainers demonstrate remarkably obedient bears, or perhaps remarkably patient bears. The distinction remains uncertain. Crowds gather instantly. Children stare without blinking. Adults pretend they aren't equally fascinated. They absolutely are. Spectacle has always attracted human attention. Some instincts require no historical explanation. Of course, festivals occasionally produce minor trouble. Too much ale, too much confidence, too little judgment. Someone starts an argument over a game. Someone else insists his pig won last year's contest despite everyone remembering quite clearly that it didn't. Village officials quietly intervene. Peace returns. Life continues. Communities that lived together every day became remarkably skilled at settling small disagreements. They had little choice. Tomorrow everyone would still be neighbors. As evening approaches, torches begin replacing sunlight. The musicians slow their tempo. Families gather around outdoor fires. Stories become quieter. Children gradually grow sleepy despite insisting they are absolutely not tired. Every parent recognizes the performance. It has remained unchanged for centuries. The stars emerge one by one above the village. Smoke rises gently into the cool night. Someone begins singing an old song. Others quietly join. No audience. No applause. Just familiar voices sharing familiar melodies beneath an ancient sky. Perhaps this is one of the loveliest moments in medieval life. No kings, no politics, no battles, no grand ambitions. Just ordinary people enjoying one peaceful evening together before another working week begins. History often remembers extraordinary days. Yet civilizations are sustained by evenings exactly like this one. Simple, warm, shared. As the final embers glow softly and families begin walking home beneath moonlight, we'll continue our journey next time to another fascinating corner of medieval life. We'll enter the workshops of master craftsmen, apprentice builders, cathedral masons, and the remarkable people who slowly transformed forests into towns and stone, into some of the greatest buildings Europe has ever known. Because while kings dreamed of glory, morning arrives quietly again. The festival fires have long since burned down. The music has faded into memory. The village square has returned to its ordinary rhythm. Someone is already sweeping yesterday's straw from the streets. A baker slides fresh loaves into a hot oven. A rooster, displaying the same boundless confidence we have come to expect from medieval roosters, loudly announces a sunrise that everyone had already noticed. Thank you, good sir. Very helpful. The town slowly stretches awake. Today, however, we're not following kings, nor queens, nor wandering merchants. Instead, we're spending time with people whose names history rarely remembered. And yet, without them, very little of medieval Europe would still be standing. The builders, the stonecutters, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, the glassmakers, the roofers, the men and women whose hands quietly transformed forests into houses, villages into towns, and empty fields and cathedrals that still stand nearly 1,000 years later. History often remembers the person who commissioned a building, far less often the thousands who actually built it. So, today, let's slow down enough to meet them. The first sound you hear is not conversation. It's rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The steady ring of iron against stone. Another hammer answers from somewhere farther down the street. Then another. Soon the entire construction site feels almost musical. Not loud, simply alive. Each worker keeps a slightly different tempo. Together they create something resembling an orchestra made entirely from patience. The smell is equally familiar. Fresh-cut oak, damp limestone, hot iron, wood shavings, lime mortar, smoke from nearby cooking fires. Dust hangs gently in the morning sunlight. Everyone seems busy. Nobody seems hurried. Large medieval buildings demanded one quality above all others: time, quite extraordinary amounts of it. Imagine beginning construction on a cathedral, not expecting to finish it yourself, not even expecting your children to finish it. Perhaps your grandchildren won't see it completed either. Some great cathedrals required over a century. Others stretched across 2 or even 3 centuries. Generations devoted their entire lives to projects whose finished form they would never witness. That is an astonishing way to think about the future. Modern construction projects often measure deadlines in months. A medieval master builder might quietly reply, 120 years seems reasonable. Different centuries, different expectations. Let's meet the master mason. He isn't simply a stonecutter. He's an engineer, an architect, a mathematician, a project manager, a teacher, all at once. The title carries enormous responsibility. He studies drawing scratched carefully onto parchment, sometimes directly onto smooth plaster floors. Measurements must be exact. An error of only a few inches near the foundation might become several feet at the roof. Gravity has always been an unforgiving critic. Fortunately, medieval builders respected gravity enormously. Ignoring it generally produced educational experiences. Very brief educational experiences. The apprentice watches carefully. Perhaps he's 12 years old. Perhaps 14. Today he carries tools. Sweeps the workshop. Mixes mortar. Sharpens chisels. Observes everything. He asks questions. Sometimes sensible ones. Sometimes wonderfully imaginative ones. His master answers patiently. Usually, good apprentices become skilled craftsmen. Excellent apprentices eventually replace their teachers. Knowledge moves quietly from one generation to another, one careful lesson at a time. Stone arrived from nearby quarries, enormous blocks hauled by teams of oxen. The journey alone may require days. Workers examine each piece carefully. Not every stone belongs everywhere. Some resist weather better. Others carve more easily. Experience teaches a difference. A skilled mason can look at limestone and almost imagine the finished column already hidden inside, rather like a sculptor seeing a statue before touching the chisel. Each tool possesses its own purpose. Point chisels, flat chisels, wooden mallets, iron hammers, squares, plumb lines, levels, simple instruments, extraordinary results. Modern technology often impresses us with complexity. The medieval builder achieved astonishing precision using tools whose design changed very little across centuries. Sometimes mastery matters more than machinery. Now, let's quietly visit the carpenter's workshop. The smell changes immediately. Fresh oak fills the air. Long wooden beams rest across sturdy benches. Curly shavings gather around workers' feet like little ribbons. Someone is shaping a roof beam. Another fits a mortise and tenon joint so perfectly that no nail becomes necessary. The pieces simply lock together. Patiently, elegantly, the medieval carpenter understood with almost the way a musician understands an instrument. Every tree behaved differently. Oak, elm, ash, chestnut, each possessed its own character, its own strengths, its own quiet personality. Choosing the wrong timber could create problems decades later. Choosing the right one allowed buildings to survive centuries. Many medieval forests were carefully managed. Contrary to popular imagination, people did not simply cut every tree they found. The builders have gone home. Their hammers rest neatly beside unfinished walls. The scent of fresh-cut oak still lingers in the cool evening air. A cathedral rises only a little higher than it did yesterday. Perhaps no one passing through town would even notice the difference. But the master mason would. He always would. Progress in the Middle Ages often happened exactly like that. Quietly, patiently, one careful day after another. Now, as dawn returns once again, we leave the noisy construction yard behind. Instead, we're walking toward one of the calmest places in medieval Europe, a monastery. Not because monasteries were silent all the time. Far from it. Someone was always baking bread. Someone was tending gardens. Someone was ringing bells with great enthusiasm. Someone, somewhere, was almost certainly looking for a missing key. Large communities have never escaped that particular mystery. But compared to the bustle of castles and markets, a monastery feels wonderfully peaceful. The stone walls seem to soften every sound. The gardens smell of rosemary, sage, and lavender. Morning mist hangs over neat vegetable plots. Apple trees cast long shadows across narrow paths. The first rays of sunlight catch tiny drops of dew resting on herbs carefully planted generations ago. Everything seems slower here, not lazy, simply deliberate. A place where people measure life less by excitement and more by rhythm. The monastery wakes before sunrise. Long before, a bell echoes through the sleeping buildings. Soft at first, then stronger. Monks rise quietly. Nobody complains aloud, though one suspects at least a few quietly wish the bell might have waited another 10 minutes. Human nature rarely changes. Sleep has always been persuasive. The brothers dress in simple robes. Candles flicker in dark hallways. One by one they enter the chapel. Morning prayer begins. Outside, the world is still almost completely dark. Only birds seem convinced the day has already started. After prayer comes work. That surprised many modern historians. The popular image of monks simply sitting around reading ancient books all day is rather incomplete. Reading certainly happened. A great deal, but so did gardening, cooking, teaching, brewing, building, repairing roofs, caring for travelers, looking after the sick, managing farms, keeping records. Monasteries function almost like small self-contained villages. Every person contributed. Even scholars occasionally had muddy boots. Knowledge and practical work lived comfortably beside one another. Let's quietly enter the scriptorium. This is perhaps the most famous room in any medieval monastery. It feels surprisingly bright. Large windows admit as much daylight as possible. Candles are expensive. Sunlight is free. Long wooden desks line the room. Each monk sits with extraordinary patience. One copies a Bible. Another carefully illustrates the first letter of a psalm using brilliant blue pigment. Another sharpens a goose feather into a new quill. The only sounds are scratching pens, the turning of parchment, and the occasional quiet cough. It may be the most peaceful workplace in Europe. Every single book here is written by hand. Every letter, every sentence, every page. Imagine copying a modern novel without making mistakes, using only ink and a feather. Now imagine doing that hundreds of times over an entire lifetime. The patience becomes almost unimaginable. Some manuscripts required months. Others took years. Large Bibles might occupy several scribes working together for extended periods. Books represented enormous investments of time. Perhaps that is why they were treasured so deeply. The parchment itself deserves admiration. It wasn't paper. Not yet. Instead, pages were prepared from carefully treated animal skins, usually sheep, goats, or calves. Creating smooth parchment required skill long before a single word could be written. Nothing was wasted. If a manuscript became damaged beyond repair, valuable parchment might even be scraped clean and used again. These recycled manuscripts are called palimpsests. Sometimes, with modern technology, historians can still read the older hidden writing beneath. It's almost like discovering whispers from another century quietly waiting beneath the surface. History occasionally enjoys leaving little surprises. The inks came from surprisingly ordinary ingredients. Oak galls, iron salts, plant materials, soot. Nature quietly provided much of what medieval scholars needed. The colors decorating illuminated manuscripts often traveled astonishing distances. Blue pigment made from lapis lazuli came all the way from present-day Afghanistan. Imagine that journey. Thousands of miles, across mountains, across deserts, across kingdoms, eventually arriving in a quiet monastery where one careful monk would use just a tiny amount to paint the robe of the Virgin Mary. Global trade existed long before modern shipping containers. It simply moved more patiently. Now, let's meet one remarkable scholar, the Venerable Bede. Living in Northumbria during the 7th and 8th centuries, Bede spent much of his life inside the monastery at Jarrow. He rarely traveled far, yet through books, letters, and careful observation, he became one of Europe's greatest historians. His ecclesiastical history of the English people remains one of our most valuable sources for early medieval England. Without Bede, entire chapters of English history might simply have vanished, not because anyone destroyed them, but because nobody wrote them down. Sometimes preserving history proves just as important as making it. Bede also studied astronomy, mathematics, grammar, biblical interpretation, chronology. He helped popularize the dating system using the years before and after the birth of Christ. The calendar many of us use today quietly owes something to his careful scholarship. Not bad for someone who spent most of his life in one monastery. It turns out curiosity travels remarkably well without needing frequent vacations. Let's quietly walk into the monastery library. By modern standards, it feels small, perhaps a few hundred books, maybe fewer. Yet within these shelves rests an astonishing amount of knowledge. Works by Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, classical writers like Virgil and Cicero, medical texts, legal collections, mathematics, music theory, philosophy, every volume carefully chained or stored safely. Not because monks distrusted each other. Books were simply too precious to lose. Imagine accidentally misplacing something that required 2 years to copy. One becomes understandably cautious. Visitors occasionally arrive seeking knowledge. Young students, traveling priests, even nobles. The monastery serves as a school. Education spreads quietly outward. A boy studies Latin here. Years later, he becomes a bishop. Another enters royal service. A third returns to his village as the local priest. Ideas travel with people, always have. Education rarely remains where it begins. Now let's cross Europe to another extraordinary figure, Hildegard of Bingen, born around 1098. Abbess, composer, writer, mystic, scientist, natural historian, physician. One almost runs out of titles before running out of achievements. She wrote about medicine, plants, the human body, music, theology, nature. She composed beautiful sacred songs still performed today. She corresponded with emperors and popes. People sought her advice from across Europe. Quite remarkable for someone living in an age often unfairly dismissed as intellectually stagnant. History becomes much richer once we meet the people who refuse to fit modern stereotypes. Hildegard also loved observing nature. She described birds, fish, trees, herbs, the changing seasons. Many medieval scholars viewed the natural world with deep curiosity, not merely as scenery, but as something worth studying carefully. The world itself became a book waiting to be read, a lovely metaphor, and one they took quite seriously. Meanwhile, somewhere else in Europe, another scholar studies ancient Greek ideas translated through Arabic texts, because knowledge in the medieval world constantly crossed cultures. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded the works of Aristotle. Mathematics flourished in Baghdad. Medicine advanced in Cordoba. Astronomy developed across the Islamic world. Latin scholars gradually translated many of these works into European languages. Learning rarely belongs to one civilization alone. It grows through conversation, across borders, across languages, across centuries. The monastery kitchen smells wonderful by now. Fresh bread cools on wooden shelves. Vegetable soup simmers gently. Cheese waits beside baskets of apples. Simple meals. Nutritious. Nothing extravagant. The monks eat together in quiet companionship, often while one brother reads aloud from scripture or the lives of the saints. Even lunch becomes another opportunity to learn, though one imagines a few listeners occasionally becoming distracted by particularly good bread. Entirely understandable. As afternoon sunlight begins stretching across the cloister garden, several monks tend medicinal herbs. Sage, mint, chamomile, fennel, lavender. The monastery garden functions almost like a living pharmacy. Travelers arrive seeking remedies. Nearby villagers ask for advice. Experience accumulates over generations. Some treatments prove genuinely effective, others less so, but careful observation slowly improves understanding. Science often begins with someone quietly paying attention. The day gradually winds toward evening. Pens are cleaned, ink pots covered, books carefully wrapped. The library doors close. One final bell echoes through the monastery. Evening prayers begin. Outside, the sky turns golden. Swallows dart above the gardens. The world feels wonderfully still. Perhaps that's the greatest gift monasteries quietly offered medieval Europe. Not only books, not only education, not only preserved history, but places where people believed careful thought mattered, where patience mattered, where curiosity mattered, where one person copying a single page could unknowingly preserve wisdom for 1,000 years. As darkness settles gently over the cloister roofs and the last candle flickers beside an unfinished manuscript, we'll continue our journey next time. The monastery bell fades gently into the evening. Its echo drifts across the fields, then disappears into the quiet countryside. The monks return to their evening prayers. The last candle in the scriptorium flickers beside an unfinished manuscript. Somewhere, a patient scribe carefully places a feather quill beside a bottle of ink, knowing tomorrow he'll continue exactly where he stopped. History often advances one sentence at a time. Now, we step back outside. The morning air feels wonderfully fresh. Mist hangs low over narrow roads. A robin lands briefly on a weathered fence before darting into a nearby hedge. The smell of damp earth mixes with fresh hay and distant with smoke. Ahead stretches a road. Not paved, not perfectly straight, certainly not smooth, but busy, far busier than many people imagine. Because despite the popular image of isolated medieval villages, Europe was constantly moving. People traveled, merchants traveled, pilgrims traveled, students traveled, monks traveled, messengers traveled, kings traveled. So often they probably became tired of unpacking. The medieval world was not frozen. It simply moved at the speed of horses, walking boots, and favorable weather, which, admittedly, required rather more patience than modern traffic, although perhaps less road rage. Let's begin walking. The road itself seems almost alive. Cartwheels have carved deep grooves into the earth over generations. Rainwater sometimes fills them. Grass grows between them. Countless feet have passed this way, some wealthy, some desperately poor, some joyful, some grieving, some carrying valuable silk, others carrying nothing more than hope. Roads never ask where you're going. They simply continue waiting. A merchant approaches from the opposite direction. His wagon creaks with every turn of the wheels. 2 patient oxen pull steadily forward. They're in no hurry. Oxen rarely are. The merchant greets us politely. Travel encourages conversation. Even brief encounters become welcome breaks from long hours of walking. He tells us he's been on the road for nearly 3 weeks. His wagon carries wool cloth from Flanders. In exchange, he hopes to purchase wine farther south, if prices cooperate. Prices, of course, possess a stubborn tendency to ignore everyone's plans. That has remained remarkably consistent throughout history. Medieval merchants often belonged to trading networks stretching across hundreds or even thousands of miles. Italian merchants carried spices. English traders exported wool. Baltic ships transported timber. Scandinavian merchants sold fish. French vineyards supplied wine. No single kingdom produced everything it needed. Trade quietly connected them all. Imagine tasting cinnamon in Northern Europe. That tiny spice may have traveled farther than most medieval people ever would. Quite an adventurous career for a pinch of seasoning. Now let's meet another traveler, a pilgrim. Unlike the merchant, the pilgrim carries little. A walking staff, a leather satchel, a broad hat protecting against rain and sun, perhaps a small wooden cross hanging from a cord. His boots already show signs of many miles. Pilgrimage formed one of medieval Europe's great shared experiences. People walked astonishing distances, not for profit, not for conquest, simply because faith called them onward. Some journeys lasted weeks, others consumed months, a few lasted years. One of the greatest destinations was Santiago de Compostela in Spain. According to tradition, the shrine held the remains of St. James. Pilgrims came from England, Germany, Italy, France, even farther away. The roads leading toward Santiago gradually filled with hostels, monasteries, bridges, hospitals, and villages eager to welcome weary travelers. An entire infrastructure quietly developed around human movement. Long before tourism became an industry, pilgrims recognized one another immediately. Many wore the famous scallop shell attached to hats, or cloaks, a simple symbol, yet instantly meaningful. Imagine seeing someone wearing the same small badge after hundreds of lonely miles. Conversation would begin almost automatically. Shared journeys create friendships remarkably quickly. They always have. The road climbs gently into woodland. Tall oak trees spread their branches overhead. Birdsong replaces the sounds of distant villages. Sunlight filters through leaves in soft green patterns. The forest feels peaceful, not frightening. Modern stories often portray medieval forests as endlessly dangerous. Reality was more balanced. Yes, dangers existed. Bandits occasionally appeared. Wild animals certainly lived here. People could become lost. But forests were also familiar workplaces. Hunters knew them. Woodcutters knew them. Monks gathered herbs here. Children collected berries. Many medieval people spent large portions of their lives among trees. The forest represented opportunity as much as uncertainty. Speaking of uncertainty, road conditions varied dramatically. Some Roman roads still survived centuries after the empire itself had disappeared. Their stone foundations remained astonishingly durable. Other routes dissolved into muddy tracks after heavy rain. Crossing rivers became particularly interesting. Where bridges existed, travelers happily used them. Where they didn't, well, one simply hoped the horse appreciated swimming. Let's pause beside a bridge. Stone arches span a gently flowing river. A small chapel stands nearby. Many bridges included chapels where travelers paused to pray before continuing. Building bridges counted as charitable works. Maintaining them did too. Entire communities benefited. Sometimes wealthy nobles donated money. Sometimes monasteries supervised repairs. Sometimes local villagers simply worked together. Infrastructure has always depended upon cooperation, even if nobody used that word at the time. Now, let's quietly visit one of medieval Europe's busiest trade routes, the Hanseatic League. Beginning in the 13th century, merchant cities around the Baltic and North Sea formed an extraordinary commercial alliance. Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Riga, Tallinn, dozens more. Together, they protected trade, shared information, negotiated privileges. Ships carried grain, wax, furs, timber, fish, cloth. The lead became so successful that kings often negotiated directly with merchants. Commerce occasionally speaks with surprisingly persuasive authority. Back on our country road, we meet a university student. His clothing looks practical rather than fashionable. A few books are carefully wrapped in cloth inside his satchel. Books remain expensive. Protecting them matters enormously. He's traveling toward Paris, or perhaps Bologna, or Oxford, one of Europe's growing universities. Students wander astonishing distances in pursuit of education. Some arrived barely able to afford meals. Others came from wealthy families. All hoped knowledge might improve their future. A familiar ambition. Universities themselves felt wonderfully international. Latin served as the common language. A German student might debate philosophy with an Italian professor while sitting beside an English classmate. Ideas ignored political borders with remarkable enthusiasm. Scholars argued constantly, respectfully, usually. Academic disagreement appears to be one of humanity's oldest traditions. Modern professors might feel strangely at home. The afternoon grows warmer. Travelers stop beside an inn, not luxurious, simply welcoming. A sturdy timber building with smoke curling from the chimney. The smell reaches us long before the doorway does. Fresh stew, baking bread, roasted onions, perhaps a little ale. Inside, long wooden tables fill the common room. A merchant speaks with a pilgrim. Two farmers discuss harvest prospects. Someone tunes a small fiddle near the fire. Dogs sleep beneath benches. They seem entirely convinced that eventually someone will drop food. Experience has taught them optimism. Medieval inns varied enormously. Some offered genuine comfort. Others provided little more than shelter from rain. Travelers generally accepted whatever appeared before sunset. Walking another 20 miles after dark rarely seemed appealing, especially if wolves had recently been reported nearby. Or worse, particularly enthusiastic geese. We have learned enough by now to respect medieval geese. News traveled along roads as efficiently as merchandise. A traveler arriving from another kingdom brought stories, political rumors, harvest reports, royal marriages, unusual weather, sometimes wildly exaggerated tales. Humans have always enjoyed improving a story slightly before repeating it. By the third village, one missing cow might somehow become 12. By the fifth, perhaps the cow had joined a monastery. Information traveled. Accuracy occasionally struggled to keep pace. Let's quietly meet perhaps the greatest traveler of the Middle Ages, Marco Polo. Born in Venice around 1254, he journeyed astonishing distances across Asia, eventually serving at the court of Kublai Khan. His descriptions introduced many Europeans to places they had never imagined. Some readers doubted parts of his account. Others became fascinated. Regardless, his travels expanded Europe's understanding of the wider world. Curiosity often begins with someone willing to keep walking beyond familiar horizons. As evening approaches, the road slowly empties. Travelers seek shelter before darkness. The merchant reaches another town. The pilgrim finds a monastery offering simple hospitality. The student settles into an inn, carefully placing his precious books beside the bed. The horses receive fresh water. Boots are removed with audible relief. One suspects medieval feet appreciated evening almost as much as modern ones. After 20 miles of walking, who wouldn't? Outside, stars appear one by one. The road lies quiet beneath moonlight. Yet tomorrow, before sunrise, it will awaken again. Another merchant, another messenger, another family moving toward a new village, another scholar chasing knowledge, another pilgrim following faith, another child seeing the wider world for the first time. Roads possess remarkable patience. They never hurry anyone. They simply wait, century after century, footstep after footstep, connecting lives that might otherwise never meet. Perhaps that's their quiet lesson. History wasn't built only inside castles or cathedrals. It also unfolded between them, along dusty roads where strangers became companions for a day's walk, where ideas crossed kingdoms without carrying swords, and where every sunrise invited someone somewhere to begin another journey.